more than 40, but beyond that, north of that, I really don't, the number's going to look like, and they'll likely pop in and pop out as we go. It's 11 o'clock now, so we'll get started. There should be no real reason for you to have to type your name in or your V number as we get this started. You will have already registered. Carla's got your V number. And the importance behind getting that was so that we could register, we could log you and then submit you in for your 3 PDP points. And in the spirit of 3 PDP credits, I should say, not points, this is a 3-hour webinar. We start at 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock now, so we're starting. We're going to take a break, a 10-minute break on the hour. So after the first hour, we'll take a 10-minute break. Go do what you need to do, answer your phones, your emails, grab coffee, bathroom, whatever. And then again at 1 o'clock, we'll take another 10-minute break just to give you some idea of when we're going to be taking those breaks. I put the agenda up, as you can all see, so that you have some degree of confidence knowing that if there's a thought in your mind about why you're here, that we likely are going to be covering it. There's some things we won't be using. For example, we won't be using polls in this particular version simply because this is set up as a meeting and not a webinar, and I don't have the function, I believe, to use a poll in here. And if we do, I didn't learn it, so I'll learn it for the next one. So welcome, all of you. Carla says there's 120 people registered, and no doubt this is a topic that I feel will strike a chord for most realtors. And as you finish up today and go out into the world and talk about this, I imagine if we do this again, the numbers will look like 120 or perhaps beyond. Just to kind of first and foremost say, okay, I'd like to acknowledge all of you for being here. Thank you. Genuinely appreciate this from the boards wide, whether it be Fraser Valley, Chilliwack, and or the Vancouver board. We also have a representative from BCREA in here watching as well too, to see what conversations amongst members look like when we're talking about material latent defects, defining them, if there are the kinds of questions we'll have around them, the confusions around disclosures, defining what they are. So this is really meant to be a rough cut version of an informal conversation with a structure, as you can see on that agenda, so we can cover the bases, hit the topics that I think are really relevant, and see where this goes from here. We might do this again in a month from now and carry on, or it might be something that gets picked up by one of the associations to perhaps offer up to all membership, all realtors as a standalone, which sort of in my heart of hearts, I feel like a topic like this, when I talked with Brian, Ken and Jane, Carol, DeBoer, and with Michael, like we feel like there's a real need to unpack and uncover the so-called mystery of an MLD, and not the obvious ones that we know, but of course there are some other less obvious material latent defects. So this whole idea of doing this today came up from the idea that we had an office meeting about a month ago, and in the office meeting, we started talking about material latent defects and throwing out what our versions of when we should disclose them, how it should be disclosed into the room. And as we were talking about it at our office meeting, we could see that this was a topic well worth diving in a little bit deeper so that we could as professionals have a better understanding of what they are, how to identify them, when to disclose them, why we must disclose, under what authority are we disclosing. So I want to thank Carla for helping me set this up. You're awesome, Carla. I really appreciate your help on this. And I also want to thank our panelists, Brian, Ken, Carol, Michael. From my heart, thank you. I'm grateful that you were willing to step in and be a part of this experiment, if we can call it that. So thank you. And for everyone here, thank you for being here. So what we're going to do is you all don't have to worry about your mute. If I notice you're unmuted and there's some noise going on in the background, I've got control. I'll go in and mute you up so that there's no double feedback. Because as I prefaced already, this is really meant to be a rough cut discussion around the topic that I feel is important for us. And it is, so as we go, if a question comes up for you, post it in the chat group. I'll do my best to keep an eye on that and put it out to the panelists so we can unpack your question and hopefully get your question answered. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Let's set the stage for what we're going to do. We're going to have an in-depth conversation around a patent defect or patent defect, tomato, latent defects. We're going to talk about latent defects. We're going to discuss material latent defects, and we're going to dive in a little bit on stigmas. We're going to talk about caveat emptor and how does that play in? Why does that play in? Where does it play in? We're going to have a brief discussion around common law and how is that different from our fiduciary duties through BCFSA. So again, as I said, put your questions into the chat, no problem whatsoever. We will be taking 2 10-minute breaks on the hour. We will go for 3 hours. As promised, there'll be 3 PDP credits offered up here. And Carla, you've all registered, so Carla's got your information. So there's no need to put it into the chat room here. It's been captured, and we'll then submit it on your behalf so that you can get credit for it. Reach out to us if you notice in about 2 weeks if it hasn't been registered on your Paragon site there. So we're also going to talk about, for the most part, we're going to get into the framework around our obligations on MLD disclosures. How can we recognize them as professionals walking into properties as a listing agent with those eyes, and as professionals walking into a property with your buyers? There are scenarios, no doubt, where you'll see an MLD, an obvious MLD, that just hasn't been disclosed by the listing agent. So what do you do? How do you protect yourself and your buyer around that? And then we'll sort of towards the tail end, we'll talk about who are we actually responsible to as agents when it comes to the disclosure of material latent defects. Obviously, you can see where we've got BCFSA as part of this discussion, your brokerage, our clients, of course, our fellow realtors, and of course, lastly, the public. And then something that a personal story of mine, what do you do if you filled out your property disclosure statement, you're marketing a property, and then you find out some part of the home has been renovated, but with no permits? All the while you believed there were, and it just took there was a bit of a delay of getting the information you needed from the municipality back to you. And once you got it back, you realize, oh boy, we've got an MLD. What do you do if you've already got an accepted offer? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well too. There's a lot of meat on the bone, so to speak, here, and we're going to take our time. So we're going to go and I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Brian. Since you're the new kid on the block.
Hey, I'm Brian, new to Keller Williams. Been realtor for just about 10 years now, primarily Maple Ridge Pit Meadows, and yeah, just fascinating topic. Just in reading through notes and a lot of the stuff that Josh sent out to us, I think a lot of personal stories kind of from different client experiences throughout the time. So I'll be happy to chime in with lots of those and see where those go. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for hosting this, Josh. I think it's important.
We lose you. Josh, I can see your lips moving.
I'm muted. I'm like, Carol, unmute yourself, and I'm muted. I'm like, Carol, unmute yourself, and I'm muted.
There I am. Hi, I'm Carol DeBoer, and I'm with Keller Williams, and I've been in the industry for slightly over 17 years, but have a banking background and mortgage background. Currently, I stepped down as associate broker, but I've been licensed before as managing broker for about 3 years. So I run across a lot of questions from agents and just try and help to the best of my ability, with the assistance of course, the Real Estate Council, which is now the FSA, and other managing brokers. And of course, Josh himself, and we like to keep our conversations open and support our agents.
Thank you. I think I'm the cause of the feedback, so I mute myself and forget I'm muted. Thanks, Carol. Thank you. Ken, let's hear from you.
Ken Ambrose with Keller Williams. Been licensed for just over 32 years. Years gone by on a number of committees at the board, committees that don't even exist anymore. Sat on the professional conduct committee for a while. To you new agents, just a priceless hint, especially in view of this conversation today. Paper trail, paper trail, paper trail. Okay, make sure you document everything. Verbals don't count. Trust me. That's about it. Hey, we're here to help the industry. We'd like to make it as professional as possible. We deserve big bucks for what we do. Let's earn it professionally.
Love it. That's beautiful. Thanks, Ken. I appreciate that. And of course, Ken and Jane are well, husband and wife. They're a team as well too. Jane is in the background listening, and I imagine she'll throw a thought or two into. No, you're actually in here, aren't you, Jane? She's also.
She is, but she's also right now in a professional conduct committee meeting. She sits on the panel too.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Yes, Michael. Let's hear from you. I hear feedback, so I'm going to go look for it. Michael, are you there?
I am.
All right, go for it.
I hear something in the background as well.
I think everybody's muted, so go for it. You're up.
Okay. Hey, good morning, everyone. Michael Tremaine. Am I coming through clear?
Yes.
Wonderful. I've been a licensed realtor for just over 30 years now. Presently, yeah, and been with Keller for the last just over 2 years now.
Yes, and he's one of our managing brokers, and again, a topic that I think you were heavily involved in at our office meeting when this was coming up, if I recall.
Yeah, correct.
So thank you. Thanks for all of you for introducing yourself. Let's talk about setting the stage in terms of what exactly are we here to talk about. Obviously, material latent defects. We hopefully will at the end of this have completely uncovered any ambiguity around it. And if we really hit the mark, then we will also have given direction as to how to disclose it, when to disclose it, and of course, why must you disclose it? So a note that I had made is it's the role of the realtor to educate the seller on the differences between patent, latent, material latent defects and stigmas. And it's our responsibility and it's also a requirement of BCFSA that we make proper disclosures around them. First and foremost, anyone on the panel, why are we even having this discussion? Like, why is this even taking place?
Because defect.
Well,
Go ahead.
protect the agents and protect our clients. So we want to do the best interest. So we should be doing discovery and be able to have that in advance. So we are doing our jobs as professionals.
Yeah, perfect. What were you going to say, Ken?
Just that same thing as Carol, you want to protect everybody, and that includes the agents. So if you see a defect, disclose it and look. Could you have looked? Yes. Did you look? No. Why didn't you look? Well, I was too busy. That doesn't wash. That doesn't go. Look, and back to my diarize. There was an excellent realtor in this town that has since retired. He did a great job with clients. Sometime later, the buyers became sellers and rolled back a carpet in the basement and found a crack. They had found it, according to him, when they bought, but he hadn't diarized anything. He didn't do a paper trail. They sued. Well, guess who won and guess who lost? The realtor lost. So find the defects and make sure that you disclose them to the client and have a paper trail that you did. So your back is protected and they're informed.
Yeah. And that's freaky, right? Because you're a listing realtor, you believe you do a good job. You're not necessarily going to find everything, but you're going to do your best. And there's certain things you're expected to know about real estate, or at least expected to be able to recognize when you see a material latent defect. If it's our responsibility to find them, then would it also be our responsibility? Let's say a listing agent takes a listing and maybe doesn't properly disclose, maybe acknowledges an illegal suite on the PDS, but doesn't document it as an MLD. And so we know that that's a problem, but would it be our responsibility, do you think, Brian, or is it incumbent upon us to let them know?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's part of the conversation. I mean, definitely, I think we're going to get into more the documenting on a property disclosure statement or on the material latent defect form and the challenges with that. It depends. I don't know how much people have kind of thought about that or looked into it, but I mean, there's definitely challenges there. And if in doubt, and it, you don't want to drop it right away, have the communication, but if you have to get the managing brokers to talk, then you got to go there, because we want to make sure everyone's protected, like Ken's saying.
Yeah, well, and you see it perfectly. Like the challenge exists. Well, and you see it perfectly. Like the challenge exists. I see there's feedback there. There's the challenge exists, number one, in being able to identify it yourself. Like if you're a listing agent and you identify it, but let's assume we're new as an agent, or perhaps we're not. Maybe we've been around for a while and we just don't quite know that, hey, this is a material latent defect and we should be disclosing it. Is there also perhaps a challenge in being the person that brings it to the other agent's attention? Like what's the challenge you might face there? What, have you ever seen any pushback around offering up a suggestion like that? And that's for you, Brian.
Yeah.
For you, Brian.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we, when you talked to me about this at my previous office, within the last year, we'd had a big debate with probably 50 agents about this, not too dissimilar to what happened at the Keller Williams meeting a month ago, where the topic gets brought up and it kind of blows up into different areas. And in my opinion, in two meetings like that, two good sized offices, good realtors on both sides of things, and it devolved into, I think the challenge could be in communicating that way is like, in my notes, I go down like, how many of us are experts on Japanese knotweed versus poly B, asbestos, a leaky roof? Because if you break down the definition, which we're going to do, maybe that's a teaser, or maybe I'm going too far ahead.
Nicely done. No, you're perfect.
But
that's awesome.
It's
nicely done. No, you're perfect. That's awesome.
I think that's the challenge, is that, I mean, it's not just a matter of a new agent, and it could be, obviously, but we've also all been in that situation where we think, how could this person think like this? There's someone we don't know, and say, how long has that person been in the industry? And yet they've been a medallion agent for 30 years. It's not, I don't think it's only about new agents, but it's about different interpretations of this. Partly, again, that we have different requirements, and we need to go to the strictest requirement, which is the definition of material latent defect by, I suppose, council, now BCFSA.
Yeah, right. Which, of course, our requirements go beyond the common law requirement of a seller for disclosure, which, of course, is dangerous or potentially dangerous or unfit for habitation. We go beyond that. That's about the extent of disclosure on the PDS, which, we have to give a whole lot of love and respect to BCREA for championing the cause of coming out with an actual separate material latent defect form. That's a new form for us. And it gives us an opportunity to get off that form, go into our personal requirements for disclosure and disclose properly, which, of course, we all know under common law, the seller doesn't actually have to disclose that, which could be a problem naturally. But I do think you're right, because there's a challenge, though, that if you see something, whether they're a seasoned realtor or a new realtor, if there was a clear set of what is a material latent defect or defects, we'd probably have a better understanding of when we see something, what we should be disclosing when we're taking listings. It's more than just determining the value, documenting the features, and then posting something on Instagram. It's about doing something on a more fiduciary level. And of course, as you said, documenting. Allison's wondering, what's the best way for you to document? How do you document things like you had described earlier, Ken?
Either in my own notes or in emails. to all the affected parties. So I got a paper trail and my back's protected, my client's back is protected. I keep a little notebook that I carry with me. I feel kind of foolish carrying it. It's 8.5 by 11, but it's really handy for jotting down notes when you need to.
Yeah, yeah.
And you were talking, Brian, about educating the seller. Just another heads up for some of the newer realtors. I'll see in comments that a home has a legal suite. So I follow up to see, okay, does it really? Or the seller will tell me my suite's legal. Oh, okay, why do you say that? Well, it's there on the municipal stat. See, it says with suite. No, that means the city has acknowledged the suite, but it doesn't mean that the suite is authorized. Right. So that's a matter of educating the seller too, or the buyer for that matter. They think they've got a legal suite and they don't. So because it was done without permits, it's got to be declared MLD.
Okay, agreed, totally. Carol, what's your thought? So you've got we're using suite. We're really gonna dig in on definitions of MLDs a little later, and we'll probably not use the suite definition as much as we're currently using it right now. But what if you come across a property, Carol, where you can clearly see there's a suite. It's illegal, but on the PDS, done without permits, but done professionally. All the work was following the code. Should you take comfort in that? Do you need to worry about that, or is it still an MLD?
Well, it's still an MLD, absolutely. So, I mean, I look at it again, and like was said earlier, you got to disclose all this stuff. You got to look at, and you want to make sure that the buyers and the sellers understand exactly what they're getting into with these suites, because they can potentially cause future problems financially for the buyer if they're relying on that, which then in the future could be shut down. So we really want to be cautious on that end. And just saying something like that as well, maybe in our contracts, we should be writing subject to both buyer and seller acknowledging that there could be potential latent or patent defects, and both parties are required to acknowledge and sign them before contracts accepted. So we can look at the whole aspect that way as well, but it should be, because illegal suites, the buyers do depend on that income, and that can be taken away if it's not done appropriately.
So are you safe then? Like, here's how I remember disclosing suites, for example. We would put a clause on the contract of purchase and sale, first of all, acknowledging that there's a tenancy agreement or a tenancy agreement, but then you make a statement, or you write in a statement that the buyer is aware that the suite is unauthorized and is, I guess, aware of the potential loss of income. I forget the exact wording, because we don't use it nearly as much as we do now. We disclose material latent defects, but there's that clause that you put on there. Would that be the same as disclosing material latent defect? But that would be for you, Kate.
Is that for Carol?
No, I would believe you have to have a separate form as well, is what I would do, just to make sure that you have covered all angles. Yeah, you want to keep that going. You want it in contract, absolutely, but you also should have the form. Pardon? Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
And have the form beforehand, so that there's acknowledges that before they can even write a contract. So it's disclosed on before that fact.
Yeah. Agree. We're going to get into that a little later, but I'm with you on that. Let's talk about patent defects. Let's start at the beginning then. What's a patent defect? I want to share something I wrote down that a couple of judges had to say regarding distinguishing the differences between patent and latent defects. And then we're going to dig into patent defects for a little bit. But a patent defects are those that can be discovered by conducting a reasonable inspection and making reasonable inquiries about the property. In general, there's a fairly high onus on the purchaser to inspect and discover patent defects. This means that a defect that may not be observable on a casual inspection, but nonetheless be patent if it would have been discoverable upon a reasonable inspection by a qualified person, which of course, you know, when you're thinking of doing subject-free offers, you got to be aware of that. In some cases, it necessitates a purchaser retaining the appropriate experts to inspect the property, and a purchaser who has no knowledge of the house construction may not recognize that he or she has observed evidence of a defect or deficiencies. And in that case, the purchaser's obligation to make reasonable inquiries of someone who is capable of providing the necessary information and answers. A purchaser who does not see defects that are obvious, visible, and readily observable, or does not understand the implications of what he or she sees, cannot impose the responsibility and liability on the vendor to bring those to his or her attention. So that brings us to patent defects. Now, what exactly are patent defects, Michael, in your mind? What are some examples that you could think of? That's for you, Michael. But you're muted. Still muted.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. It said that the host actually wanted to kick me out of the whole thing. So what are some of the obvious patent defects that you'd be looking at? Simple things like cracked windows, cracks in walls. So those are some of the easy ones for people to recognize, especially buyers. And I think you touched on it earlier. It's extremely difficult in this flurry that we're in now when you have a 15-minute showing for either us as realtors or them as our clients, buyers, to be able to really get a real strong patent defect discovery. I mean, it doesn't really lend you that opportunity.
Brian, what in your opinion are patent defects something that a seller needs to disclose?
Sorry, should probably unmute myself. I think it more falls on the buyer. I mean, if there's obvious stuff, I think there's some here where I think these fall into some of the gray category. I mean, it might not be gray, but I guess the category where there could be some disagreement on some of them. You know, a scratch. You know, the idea of a big scratch on the hardwood floor. I had a client I want to say 2 years ago. They were super annoyed. So when we came to list their house, I hadn't sold them the property, but when I came to list it, they'd lived there 3 or 4 years. When they had moved in, there was a huge scratch on the floor under the couch. Well, I don't know, even in a slower market, people aren't generally in the habit of moving every couch around to check the floor. There's a significant gouge in some really nice hardwood, and they were super annoyed. So like, we want to disclose it. Like, they jumped out of their skin to say, we're not going to do to our buyers what the last people did to us. I guess it's a patent defect. I mean, I think that those are some of the ones where I'd love to kick that around. But again, that's probably later on today. But just, you know, would it have been found in a reasonable inspection? I don't know. I don't think most inspectors are moving couches around, but they disclosed it. So I think that the responsibility falls more on the buyers with patent, because it's supposed to be stuff that can be seen.
Yeah, and of course, this is where caveat emptor kicks in. The patent defects are defects typically discovered upon a reasonable inquiry, investigation, or inspection by someone qualified. Now, you're right. Nobody moves furniture. So there is a clause we put in our contracts that requires the seller to disclose marks, stains, scratches, holes under or behind objects that typically wouldn't be moved, assuming that we put it in our contract. If we don't put it in our contract, it's still not necessarily a latent defect, nor is it required for disclosure. So, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't cause angst when your client discovers it after they've moved in and they're like, how come that wasn't disclosed? But I think the discussion and the definition around it with a buyer prior to going into a property or buying a property is probably one that would stave off an expectation where it should have been perfect when they moved in. But do we have those conversations? Like, is that a conversation that we normally have with our clients before we write an offer or while we're in the subject phase? I know I don't. It's not something that that's top of my mind. Do you, Ken, do you by chance have them? You and Jane?
Well, yeah, because I'm known as being anal anyhow. But that is from my first few years in this business when I had so many knives in my back, you couldn't find my back. Yes. And some of the stuff you're impressing your clients too. I don't know if it happens so much anymore, but it used to be people had area carpets down over hardwood floors and there was fading, which you did not discover until the area carpet was pulled up when the folks were moving. The buyer comes in and finds two different colors on the floor and gets really choked. Guess who always takes the brunt? I make a point of pulling up area carpets, not the whole carpet, but as much as you can to check and see if there's anything they should be aware of. Protects them, protects you, makes you look good. Yeah. So yeah, I ask those questions.
Do any of you know, any of the panelists, you guys can answer this question. Anybody here listening as well too, if you're aware of this, by all means speak up. But are you aware of a clause or a conversation that is considered commonplace or standard in our industry where we talk about, just so you know, buyer, these are patent defects or examples of patent defects, as much as we'll do our best to get through the home inspection and discover as much as we can. But it is possible you're going to move in and discover some things that it would still be our responsibility to find, and it doesn't fall on the seller's shoulders of disclosure.
I do an abbreviated version of that.
Yeah. You know, the moment you say that, Ken, everyone's going to want a copy of it. Which is great. That'll only improve the level of professionalism in the industry. So that's awesome.
Well, that holes, marks, stains clause, truthfully, I wrote that. I wrote that probably 20, 25 years ago because I got burned on a purchase. There was a crack in the tile in the foyer and the seller had put a plant over it.
Right.
Well, possession day came, there was no plant there, there was the crack there, and my client was a lawyer and was going ballistic.
Right.
So I said, that's never going to happen again. And that's why I came up with that clause.
Did that result in some kind of recompense by way of damages?
He was after that. I don't believe in the end he got anywhere, but boy, he was sure hostile for a while.
Right. But okay, so that brings up a really good point. So what happens when a seller, I mean, for the most part, covers up something? Because, and maybe not because they think, oh, I'm selling my place, let's cover it up so the buyer doesn't find it. Maybe it's because they never intended to replace their carpet. They didn't like the way it looked. So they went out and bought an area rug to put it down so they could look at something nicer. Or a crack on the floor and they put a flower over top of a pot of flower. And their intent isn't really to conceal it from the buyer per se. It's really just because they don't want the eyesore themselves. And of course, in their mind, they don't think about it to disclose it. And clearly they're not required to disclose it. But does that concealment, does that act of concealment ever get challenged? Or is that just something that is still falls under caveat emptor?
Guess it depends on the degree of concealment. You know, is it under the bed? Is there coffee or red wine that they forgot was there? We put that clause in about no holes, marks, stains, not reasonably expected. And we call it an AHA clause. And we explain to the realtor and to the seller that we're not meant to insult them. We just, is there something you haven't thought about or something you've forgotten? I can't tell you how many times ladies dragged me down the hall and show me, oh yeah, we spilled coffee under here. And one gentleman took me into the living room and he says, well, these speakers are attached to the walls. That mean I have to leave them?
Yeah.
I said, no, you know, we want to buy your house. We want to buy your speakers. He says, good, those are $10,000 speakers. But that's why it's an AHA clause. It's supposed to jog their memories.
Yeah. On a listing presentation, do any of you ever have a discussion around holes, marks, things that are hidden? Do you ever have a discussion around those? And if they're hidden and not easily like under, say, a couch where, you know, no one's moving the couch, Do you ever say like this would be something that would be reasonably worth disclosing, even though they don't have to disclose it? It's a patent defect. What are your thoughts on that? Start with you, Carol. I think when you talk, Carol, I think what happens is a bunch of feedback comes in. I can hear it right now. I'm going to mute myself and let's see if we can stop the feedback.
Is that better now? Perfect. Okay, I think the discussion should be, you know, I look at it, there's going to be normal wear and tear on every home. There's going to be different deficiencies on brand new properties. Nothing's going to be perfect. But I think if it's something major that they should be looking at, like a massive hole behind a picture, absolutely. But if it's just from the picture hanger, that's going to be normal. So I think that's where we have to look at it reasonably. So when people are moving in, they should expect there's going to be you know, hole from a picture hanger, but they shouldn't have like a 3-foot hole. And so those should be the hard discussions you have with your sellers. And when you're doing the data input, we should be walking through the home thoroughly with them and looking at every room, and kind of, we should be able to, as professionals, discover. And if you're a new agent, bring an experienced agent with you to eye these homes, because a lot of us been in the industry for a while, have seen a lot of homes, and we can usually detect something fairly quickly. And the uncomfortableness of walking through with the listing person, if they're uncomfortable in that area, you got to wonder why they are. So you do have to ask those hard questions.
I got to remember to unmute myself. Yes, got it. I think you're right. But again, you know, as a listing agent, it's a patent defect. Now, one that's concealed, I think, is what is worthy of some version of disclosure and minimal at risk. There's also the risk that the buyer might say, well, in a slower market, the buyer might say, well, thanks for disclosing that. Now we want you to fix it. But you don't want the seller going out of the way to hide something that shouldn't be. Brent just asked a question, Brian, and I know his playful nature. So he says, let's play with this a little. Say there's a small patent defect, red wine, crack in mirror, hole in wall, and the buyer purchases your seller's unit subject free and likely didn't see it due to no inspection and a quick 15-minute viewing. When would you bring this to their attention? At some point before the possession date out of courtesy, or during the subsequent visit before closing? What's your thoughts on that, Brian? I'll see if I can unmute you. I got you unmuted. You're good to go. I'll see if I can unmute you.
I got it. Yeah. I mean, gee, I don't know Brent, so I don't know how playful Brent is being. It's a tricky one. Yeah, no, it's hard. That's taking it. I think, you know, it's again, it's a patent defect. It wasn't. There isn't necessary to disclosure. Sorry, you're talking as if you're the buyer's agent when you disclose it. Sorry, I'm rereading it.
We're the listing agent. We sell a property, and we know of a small patent defect, but they didn't inspect it, they didn't see it, and we're sure they're going to see it when it's vacant. I'm thinking more of a courtesy to them, so they're not surprised upon possession day.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, if it's small and it's not going to be a big deal, I think I try to do the rule of thumb and try to remember that we've got to work together going forward. I mean, I guess the right answer is you have to get you have to get direction from your seller. But we can say to our seller, look, this could cause a headache later down the road. Encourage our seller, hey, is it okay if we disclose this, or if I can disclose this to the buyer's agent, just so they're aware, because it's the ones on moving day, right? I mean, ultimately, those are the ones that end up being the problem. And I would say there's a bit of a CYA for us in that, I mean, I know it's not everybody's practices aren't identical, but to be honest, that's where a lot of times a lot of us end up. We're fixing some flooring, we're getting carpet stuff done. It's costing us money. So again, you gotta keep your principal in mind at most, of course, but encouraging disclosure is always going to be better.
You know, Brian, that's awesome, because you're balancing your fiduciary duty to your client. And of course, if they don't have a requirement to disclose patent defects, and it's really up to the buyer to find them, but yet out of common courtesy and something like, is it something that I would have liked to have known if you've used that lens? Would I wanted to have known going in? The answer would likely be, yeah, I'd like to have known. Would it have impacted my decision? Me, maybe not. Who knows for another buyer, but you still have to get direction from the seller. Like they're the one that ultimately gets the right to say yay or nay. You know, I don't know about you guys when you were doing your research around this. I read a number of legal cases in Canley, and patent defect always seemed to stem right back down to buyer beware. This really, when it comes to patent defects, it's entirely up to the buyer or the buyer's agent to do their own due diligence to discover patent defects. I didn't see anything in the cases that I read about where a seller conceals a patent defect. Like there wasn't a case that brought that up, but it simply always fell under caveat emptor when it came to patent defects. And just to take it a step.
Yeah, I think it has.
And just to take it a step.
Good. I think it just has a lot to do with when you're looking at the definition, it's a reasonable inquiry or investigation. A qualified person's going to find it. If it's hidden, like mine that 5 years ago, client moves in and there was basically the entire amount of hardwood floor under the china cabinet did not exist. So you're talking, we had to refloor, in my buyer's perspective, they had to refloor an entire room. Like that, if they wanted the house to look proper, there was no matching wood. It was an old enough hardwood. They couldn't figure it out, but could a reasonable inquiry have found it? So I think where the cases go is that when it slides from patent into latent, or if there's and then in that one, the fun part about that one is the sellers swore they didn't know. Their kids did the hardwood flooring for them while they were out of town as an anniversary gift. They say they didn't know. So I think in the end, that was the bank of Brian and Taryn covered that. But I don't think it was patent, but there would be people that would argue it was.
Sure. And either way, who wants to go to court to find out, to get a judge's definition or ruling on patent or latent? Nobody. And that's where the bank of realtors come in. Has anybody else ever dug into their pocket to pay for something that you would have really appreciated some version of disclosure, but now you're the one paying for it, just so your client's happy with you at the end? For those of you that haven't, you might in time. But you know, it's interesting though, that takes place. I'll just, for the sake of adding a few more examples of patent defects, I'll throw a few in there that are obvious patent defects that don't require disclosure whatsoever. Front steps are crumbling. And by the way, these definitions came straight. I want you to know the source of them. They came from BCREA. They have two courses that if you've not taken them yet, get in there and take these courses. One is Disclosures in Real Estate, which is a fantastic course. It discusses all kinds of disclosures. And in there is the definition of material latent defects, patent defects, and so on. The other course that they teach is Contract Essentials, understanding the PDS, the Property Disclosure Statement. So those two courses there, for the most part, formed all of the information I'm going to read out to you from here and that we're going to talk about today. But other examples are front steps are crumbling, patent defect. You can see that. Garage door is broken. Or let's just say that the kids were playing ball hockey, and one of the panels is popped out. It's a patent defect. Shingles missing from the roof. Well, anybody can see that for the most part. The carpet has cigarette burns. There's a cracked window, cracked walkway. Those are patent defects. So this should help you understand what is a patent defect. And of course, you don't disclose that. You can see them. Cracked walkways, sloping floors are. There were a couple of cases where buyers that moved into the property had some sloped floors and decided to sue thinking that they were latent defects, when in fact the judge ruled out that a sloped floor in a house is a patent defect. Scratches on the hardwood floors, missing doorknobs, hole in the walls. But I'm curious, Carol, have you ever, or has anybody in here, Carol, I'll address this to you, but have you ever sold a property, it's been freshly painted, and the furniture's in place, and once your buyer moves in, and the buyer discovers that this fresh paint is wonderful, until you took the master bedroom out and you realize they painted around the bed. They didn't paint all the wall. Is that a patent defect? Is that a latent defect? Like, what is that? Is that a disclosure item? What do you do with that?
Good question. I can't imagine them painting around the bed, but I guess lots of things happen that way. You know, And again, how many people are going to pull the bed back to check that wall? How many people are going to pull different things back? You know, I've been fortunate not to have done that. Working with agents, I can say electric fireplace. There was a big TV sitting on. So the buyers go in and the fireplace is gone because they thought it was gas attached. So where do you draw that line? So all of a sudden that buyer's agent is buying a fireplace for his clients. But, you know, you got to, I think the thing is, and especially in this market, we've really got to take the time with our buyers and book an hour-long appointment if you're not going to do you know, an inspection or have a qualified person. So you can take the time and maybe do a little bit more snooping in around the house and take that time.
I would agree. I think for the most part, I love this conversation because we're talking about the obvious patent defects. And then in there are some patent defects, but they're covered up. And so I'm not really sure what direction to go when I mean, obviously you have a conversation with your seller about things that have been covered up. I think that's a smart conversation first and foremost at the listing presentation. For the record, not when you're trying to get the listing. Like that's not the point to bring them up. It's once you've got, you know, you're getting the listing and you've secured the client, and then you would then talk about some of the more common fiduciary duties that are required on your part and common law requirements on their part. That's a conversation for later, but it's definitely a conversation worth having. And are there any things that so let's say, for example, we get an offer from Ken and Jane. Their offer contains the clause that Ken created 29 years ago, no, 31 years ago. He created a long time ago, and you're sitting there with your seller. And now is that the time that you want to have the conversation with them about things that are perhaps covered up by a planter or carpet, or would you have wanted to have done that right out of the gate so you're prepared for that level of disclosure? It's worth the conversation at the very least. Let's move on to what is a latent defect, and I'll just start by reading the preamble I wrote down here, and then we'll dig in on this one for a little bit. So a latent defect is defined by common law first and foremost, and it applies to sellers, of course, as well as realtors, because we also fall under requirements of common law. A seller is only obligated to disclose latent defects, full stop. So let me just go back and say that again. Sellers are only required to disclose latent defects. Realtors' obligations go beyond common law definition of a latent defect, and we are under the category or jurisdiction of BCFSA. So a latent defect is defined as those that are not discoverable upon a reasonable inspection by a qualified person. So your home inspector comes in and didn't see the mold behind the wall. So that's an example real quick. But they render the property dangerous or potentially dangerous to occupants or unfit for habitation. And the defects just can't be discerned through a reasonable inspection of the home. And they render the premises dangerous, potentially dangerous to the occupants or unfit for, that feels like I've just said that twice, for habitation. So I've said it twice because I really want to drive the point home. So this is a latent defect, and this conversation I think is worth having. But does it, Brian? Is this a conversation you and Taryn would have with sellers when you're going through the PDS? Or well, obviously you probably would, but is it one that you guys have that you're conscious of as part of your presentation or your filling out the PDS? And what does the conversation look like when you're talking about it? And what does the conversation look like when you're talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, I think it's the idea that the things that we talk to them about, things that people wouldn't know. Definitely in preparing for this, I feel like my language is dialing in a little bit more. I feel like you just get into, well, we'll just be totally honest, right? In the speed of the market and stuff, you go pretty quick. We just, again, we talk to people about not wanting there to be surprises. And kind of the idea, I think you said it better a minute ago, Josh, just the idea that, look, if the place you're buying and someone doesn't disclose this to you, how's it going to make you feel? I mean, I understand that some sellers aren't going to care, but most people understand that, the things that are hidden. I mean, again, I feel like in prepping for this, I've got more questions than answers. So I don't know if I'm the best with this, because I think getting into some of the stuff like asbestos and stuff like that, where certain things that that definitely fit this level, like we'll get to material latent later, and our, as realtors, highest duty of care. But for a seller, part of the thing is what certain sellers actually know and don't know, and their education level. And that's probably where I have some questions on their responsibility, but I'd love to throw it out to people with much more experience than me for answers on that. Perfect timing, Ken sitting back down. But yeah, it's a conversation we have, but yeah, I don't know how far we go. Definitely the obvious things like oil tanks and asbestos and that kind of stuff. Of course, recently we have stuff more about radon, which, to be really honest, I mean, maybe I'm the only one, but my knowledge of radon is not great.
Mine as well. So let's go to Michael. Latent defects. How do you bring this up when you're? I'm assuming the latent defect conversation really only shows up when you're filling out a PDS. Would that be accurate?
I would say for most realtors, that's probably correct.
Not only is it correct, it's probably the most appropriate way to have the conversation, really. Like, where else would it really arise? It's not on the listing presentation. It's when you're filling out a PDS is when you're going to start talking about latent defects. What the PDS doesn't do, though, is actually give a sort of a laundry list of definitions. And it's probably not its job to do that. It's the realtor's job to know what that laundry list looks like so that we could talk to the sellers. Would that make sense?
I mean, if you're looking at the question on the PDS, I wish it was expanded a little further, because it only gives you dangerous or potentially dangerous to render, the home, or dangerous or potentially dangerous to occupants unfit for habitation. I mean, there's many other definitions that should be included in that, or whether they could change it and leave it up to us. I mean, the biggest one that we were talking about yesterday, Josh, was lack of municipal permits or city permits is a big one. And my suggestion was anyone who lists a house probably 2000 and on probably has some disclosure issue in relation to something that the homeowner's probably done themselves.
Well, heck, and that's not just a little rabbit hole. That's a massive rabbit hole that an entire body fits down, right? Like, you're talking about, like in Port Coquitlam, as an example, we talked about this. In Port Coquitlam, you're required to obtain a permit if you change a light fixture or your light switch or your wall plug. These require permits. Do most sellers do it? Not a chance. So now you got to know, this house was built in 1954, but that's a Decora light switch. I know for sure that's an updated light switch. Is that a disclosure? Is that a material latent defect? It certainly doesn't render the property dangerous. Maybe it did, depending on who did the electrical wiring. I don't know. But it's still, that's where the conversation would come up regardless, is in the MLD. So here, let's just talk about a couple of examples, or a few examples that I was able to get from BCREA's course, the two courses. Black mold in the walls, asbestos insulation. For the most part, I don't even know what asbestos looks like, the insulation. Like I know what vermiculite looks like when I'm in the attic, but it's not often that I poke my head in the attic. But asbestos insulation, leaking septic tanks, buried oil tanks, radon levels exceeding Canadian guidelines. Well, that, again, Brian, you said it perfectly. It's not a super common thing that we're going to run into here. Climate change is affecting your property. Kim Spencer, the ethics guy, recently talked about climate change zones falling under latent defects, especially in light of the Okanagan this past summer, the interior. Building envelope defective. So those are condos. Faulty electrical wiring hiding behind the walls. That's a small list, but it could easily be expanded, and I feel like it should be expanded. You ever had a seller, Ken, disclose a latent defect to you, or you discovered one yourself personally, and they said, Ken, I get it, but it's not really a big deal to us, and we don't think it's a big deal at all, so we prefer not to disclose it. Has that ever popped up for you and Jane?
Unmute there. I don't know if you heard anything, but yes, it did happen. the seller had a room in his home that they used for a grow up, and he did not want it disclosed. And after we talked with them, he said, sorry, can't do it. We have to disclose. We walked out the door, and yeah, the home was listed by someone else. It does happen. If I can throw in something else too, this has been coming up the last few years. If we're in a home that was built, say, in the 60s or the 70s, we ask the seller if they've experienced any dips or holes around the property. And not often they say yes, but sometimes it happens. And there's areas in Maple Ridge and Port Coquitlam that we hear of that sinkholes are happening. And we're guessing, we have no idea, we're guessing that back in the 60s and 70s when the builders were clearing an area, they just buried the trees. And these trees are likely rotting. And a realtor who is probably on this seminar right now had a client, and he's a very good realtor, had a client in West Maple Ridge that phoned him, a buyer, and said, hey, there's a hole in our backyard. He went and had a look, and damn, there was quite the hole in the backyard. He went and knocked on doors around the neighborhood, and some of the neighbors said, oh yeah, we've had those. And I know of a home in Port Coquitlam that we're aware of that, you know, how come there's a little area in the backyard that keeps sinking and they keep filling it up with dirt? What's going on there? So we ask sellers, because that is a latent defect.
Yeah, well, it's potentially a sinkhole. There was a case that was just published in, I'm not sure where I saw it, could have been on the board, but it was in out of Seashell where there was a sinkhole, and the lawsuit brought forward municipality, I believe it was a district of Seashell, and or whatever they're called, and the city planners, but they were found not liable for approving the permits that allowed the construction of the homes on these properties that were lost to the sinkhole. That's where local expert knowledge comes in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sinkholes, just for interest's sake, if you're ever in a property showing a home in parts of Port Coquitlam or Maple Ridge, where the homes were built around the mid to late 50s, 1954, 59-ish, in Mary Hill, there's areas there that were likely fueled by oil. And a lot of those tanks had been buried, and the spout that you would have filled the oil up with would have been cut down below grade, so you wouldn't see it. And if you see a sinkhole in your backyard there's a possibility that that tank may have rusted, collapsed, and therefore the soil on top has fallen in, hence your sinkhole. So an easy fix is not to fill it back up with dirt. But that said, buried oil tanks definitely fall under latent defect. I'm going to read what Lisa just said. We're 3 minutes away from our first 10-minute break, and I will send us off on a bit of a break. But Lisa, so Lisa's all right with you if I read it out? I can't see you, so I'm going to assume that means yes. So just an FYI for everyone, something she had to deal with. Her buyer bought a newly renovated condo. It showed beautifully. Fireplace was on when we viewed. Buyer's inspector checked the fireplace, said it was in working order. Buyer moved in. Could not get the fireplace to work using remote and was not prepared to crawl on the floor every day to get it turned on and off. Understandable. I brought in a furnace guy to figure out the problem. It turned out the unit was broken and did not connect to the remote control. Previous owner knew about this, but figured it was good enough turning it on and off from the base. So they decided not to upgrade the insert during the reno. Inspector said that was how he inspected it, was by turning it on and off from the base. So who's responsible? The seller's agent said tough luck. Inspector said not my problem. Buyer didn't want to go to court. And this is, by the way, this is typically what happens. A buyer doesn't want to go to court, but they're angry with you. And if you want to maintain a relationship, that's where we often dig into our pockets. Let me just finish. My buyer didn't want to go to court. Buyer and I ended up splitting the cost of a new fireplace insert, $5,000. I contributed to it out of the good faith to the client. First and foremost, Lisa, that's wonderful. I mean, I think that's what I wouldn't say what a good realtor does, but you did a good job. I probably would have done the exact same thing. You're not required to do it, but well done. So Lisa, unmute yourself for a second. What exactly is the question?
It wasn't so much a question as just giving an example for others out there, because as we know in this business, we learn something new every day. And that was when this was about 1.5 years ago, I dealt with this one. And it was something I had never expected and didn't know to watch out for.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't have known either, actually, and thanks for saying so. And that falls under Brent's question of like out of courtesy to a fellow realtor, knowing full well you're likely going to see them in the future more frequently than you're going to see your client. Are you disclosing this? Are you sharing this information? Did you get permission to share it? But I imagine you would have liked to have known that, right, Lisa? Or your buyer would have too.
We would have definitely, if we'd been aware of it, we may have asked for it to be replaced, or at least it wouldn't have come as a shock after she'd already put a lot of expenses out.
You got it. Yeah, yeah. We're there at our first break. Before I go, I set us off on our first break. Keep yourselves muted so we don't hear the background. You're welcome to leave your video on or off, whatever you choose. Joanna from BCRA is here, and she just shared with us, I love the gratuitous plug. They do have an online course, self-paced online course, all about radon if you want to learn about it. I've not taken it myself. It's on my list. I've got 3 already lined up from BCRA to take, but that will be on there. So yeah, there's a catalog. I see the course catalog has also been shared in there. So go check it out. So I'm going to send you off. We're going to come back, and when we come back, we're going to dive into the MLD. We'll see you back at 12:10. So for those of you that are still in the room and can hear me well, so if you see Jane Ambrose, you see Jane's iPad, she is intently listening in on her professional conduct committee meeting, smiling at me right now. If anyone has ever wondered, like, I'm curious what it would be like if I were to step up my volunteerism within the industry, the professional conduct committee, I'm on it as well as Jane. Man, what a privilege and an honor it is to be a member in that committee, and what an eye-opener it is into the world of our field of expertise, where you learn how people get sued, how not to get sued. Jane, are you able to talk?
Yeah, I am. I'm finished my meeting. It was actually a short one today.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Fascinating but short. But yes, it is it's a great place to learn a lot of very valuable information. Great experience, will look good on your resume, and you feel, for the most part, like you're actually doing something to improve this industry.
Amen. You actually feel like you are you have a hand in shaping future good behavior. And unfortunately, by being really tough on those that do bad and sending a message to the other realtors, look, if you cross the line on the bad side, it's going to cost you. So think twice.
Exactly.
Have you volunteered other than the professional conduct committee anywhere else?
Me?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. You did.
I was a director when we used to have divisions.
Right. Right.
And I've filled in my application to volunteer at the board many, many years ago and send it back in every few years. And there's lots of opportunities.
Oh, so you still put your hat in the ring for director at the board?
I did years ago.
Okay.
But they disbanded the divisions, so we don't have those anymore.
Yeah, those local divisions that we had were really a lot of fun.
They were also really important, and I still don't understand why they felt we didn't need them, because we do. We've lost that connection to the other realtors in our areas.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Having been there like you, that it certainly gives you a different feel for a finger on the pulse about your higher organized real estate from the board level.
You agree this pizza's too old, right? I got to chuck it, right?
Hey, Scott, you should chuck that pizza for sure.
Oh, am I not muted?
No, but definitely chuck the pizza.
How did I get unmuted?
I don't know.
I'm not even playing with anything. You unmuted me. You did that to me, didn't you?
No, I didn't. That's awesome. It's not. When I bring up volunteerism, it's self-serving because Gemma wants to know: did you bring enough pizza for everyone? Gemma, I don't think you want the pizza he's talking about. I think it's bad. When you talk about volunteerism, Ray Harris was the one that got me into becoming a director in the local division, and it was the first taste that I got into organized real estate. I'd always been in the field, just listing and selling homes. And when I got into the organized end of things, it was addicting. I loved it. It was a lot of fun. All right. On that note, I'm going to quickly get myself some tea and I'll be right back. I'm going to take my video off for a moment.
Jane, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Jane Ambrose, it's Gail Beck. How are you?
I'm fine, Gail. How are you?
I'm good. Oh my God, I have to say this. It is, as I'm reading some of these disciplinary things that come down from the board, like I am shaking my head. And I just hope that, and I'm very hopeful that I won't be one of those people one day. But it really does make you go, what were you thinking when you did that?
Yeah. It's scary.
Mean?
It's scary. Yeah. Oh, and you got to read the council ones too, because they are coming up with some doozies right now as well. That's just that the BC FSA is so slow.
Yeah.
So incredibly slow. Like they're just making decisions on stuff from 2016, 2017.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's all I have for that. It makes, it does also make it, when you if you ever get stuck with a late deposit check, it kind of makes it, you feel like that isn't such a big deal anymore. You know what I mean? Even though it's a big deal. But that's there's really not a big deal,
Much bigger deals out there. Yes.
Oh my God. Anyway, it is good to see you, honey. You know what I mean?
It was great to see you too.
Are you muted?
Jane, one other question.
Absolutely.
Did you ever get your cell phone thing figured out? Did you go with a different provider?
No, actually, we stayed with Rogers because there is a plan through Rogers through the through Ontario Real Estate Association.
Okay.
That covers anybody in Canada, and it's basically just the $56 a month. You just have to.
That's pretty much what I did too. I went through a BCRA and just, because I own my phone now and I plan on keeping it for a while. So
yeah.
So I got the $55 plan or some craziness. So yeah, cut my bill in half.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, what? Why didn't I know about this? Well, because I never asked.
Yeah. Anyway, I've got to go and do something before we have to get back to this. So I will chat to you in a bit.
Bye.
Bye.
You know, Joanna, on that BCREA mobile plan, I looked at it, I think a year ago, and thought, man, that's a good deal. I should dive in on it. Never did. I should have though. Might look back at it.
I have my headphones on, but and I'm walking around the house like collecting laundry. So I'm listening and I'm like, I gotta run back to my computer to unpress the mute button. But yeah, you know what? I was with Rogers before, just on my own plan, and I switched over to it, and it's also on Rogers, so it's the same network, but it's half the price.
Half the price.
You know,
I think
half the price.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm jumping in for 1 second. It's Lisa Morris.
Hi, Lisa.
I have the same issue right now. I kind of have to decide in the next 6 weeks because I'm waiting to get my new phone of what plan I'm going to go on. So this meeting's been very valuable for 2 reasons.
Yeah, good to hear. Good to hear. Yeah, I'm not sure how well known the plan is. Like, one of my colleagues had it, and here we are advertising. I didn't even know about it as a staff member, and then one of my colleagues is like, "Oh yeah, I put everybody on the family on it," and I was like, "Oh, okay, like $50 a month I'm saving."
That's a lot of money. That's
yeah. I knew I had, to be honest, I knew I had a shitty plan before.
Yeah.
I just didn't get around to doing something about it. Yeah.
You know, there's a degree of complacency that kicks in once you've got your phone, it's up and running, and you're paying your $89 or whatever it is. You're like, forget it. I'm just gonna roll with what I got. But that I looked at it last year. I believe the conversation though led me to Calgary. Like I was talking to somebody. Is it out of Alberta or does this?
It is. Yeah, so we've combined with Alberta, and it just helps keep the cost of maintaining it down. Mm-hmm.
Wicked. Mark George says he loves that plan, saves over $80 a month when he switched over. I think I'm going to make that switch. I'm on a month to month with my bat phone, so I think I'm going to.
Nice. You want to check into that. Pardon me for interrupting. I discovered that when you join that one from area, the Alberta Real Estate Association, you give them your phone number. So then if you ever leave, you have to get your phone number back from them. So I opted to stay with Rogers.
Jane, they can have it. This phone goes off way too freaking much. They can have it, no problem.
Well, no, if you've got your number that you've had for 30 some odd years, like Ken has, you don't want to lose that number.
Oh, yeah.
So the Rogers one is the same price, basically. So.
Got it.
Yeah, this one is with Rogers, and so it's more just like a corporate plan, you know, like it works kind of like company phones, right? So they take the phone number up underneath them. I don't know what will happen when we leave, if they just give you your phone number back and walk away. I haven't heard anybody who's been through that process, so I don't know how that will work.
Yeah, and that's true. They should give it back to you. But that's not a risk I'm willing to take or have to take that battle when I can stay with Rogers and do the same thing, still get the same price. And
well, if you're getting the same price,
control everything, and like I'm a control freak.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Aren't most realtors, Jane? Aren't really?
Yeah.
That could be the topic for another webinar, actually. Control Freaks Anonymous, except we're not really all that anonymous. I've got my water boiling for my next cup of tea. We're at that time now where we're stepping back into the room. Most people have their videos turned off, which are perfectly fine. You don't need to take your video off if you don't want to. We are going to start now the conversation on the material latent defect. We're going to spend some time on this particular topic. And then afterwards, we're going to roll into some other things that I found fairly interesting. I want to just take 1 second, if I may, to acknowledge Joanna Peterson for being here. Joanna Peterson is, she's one of the big wigs over at BCREA, and she and Jennifer Lynch, they're part of the education. They're the ones that put these courses on. And if you've not taken, if you're familiar with and used to taking courses through your board, whether it be the Fraser Valley board or the Vancouver board, those courses are fantastic. When you take a good look at the course catalog that BCREA has put in, they're putting it in with the highest and best intentions in mind for you, to support you as realtors to elevate your professional game so that when you're in front of your clients, you're super informed. And the online, Joanne, I just want to throw a shout out on these online ones are fantastic because it feels like I not own the course, but I've got the content and access to it now, which allowed me to go back and retake both courses that I had already taken for points last year and help put together sort of a framework around this course, this discussion today. So BCREA should definitely be your first stop for education. You should dive on in. They just added a new one. Well, it's for managing brokers, the $275 one. I signed up for that one, so I look forward to getting in there.
You were one of our first registrants there, Josh. I saw your name on there. So as of a couple of days ago, I think we had 6 registrants. The anti-money laundering course, it's registration's live, but the course actually isn't accessible till October 20th. We're frantically putting the last little bits and pieces together for the course right now.
Yeah, and for the record, like that's not one that I believe that you get PDP credit for. And I could care. Oh, you do? Okay.
You do. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it not a 9-hour course?
Well, it's at least a 9-hour course. We were just talking about this yesterday. So this is an anti-money laundering, mastering compliance, anti-money laundering training for brokers and compliance officers. So this is not the course that every realtor out there would take on anti-money laundering. It's really about a brokerage compliance program, looking at what are you doing to meeting all the compliance obligations from the brokerage perspective. And so to work through the online content, I would expect it to be about 9 hours of material. It's a big course, but the course offers some different tools to help brokers or compliance officers evaluate how are you doing in compliance in your brokerage. Some assessment checklists and things to say, okay, are we doing this? Can we do this? So if you do the homework, I'd expect it to be more than 9 hours. The flip side of that is that you need to be doing all of that to meet your FinTrack requirements anyway. So it's about implementing. So expect 9 hours in the course, but expect more time depending on your starting point for implementation of the things that you're learning. So just managing your expectations.
Well,
You're not gonna
you're
not gonna pull this off in an evening. It's something to bite off in bits and pieces over time as you're working on it. How is that for selling the course to people?
Well, you still,
sales.
I still would have signed up if I had heard you say that first. I still would have gone and pressed send on the credit card. I would have done it for sure.
Yeah, I'll put information on. There's a couple questions in the chat. I'll find a couple links and post it there for people.
Thank you. Yeah, Tanya wanted to know what the course was called. But Tanya, if you're a managing broker or aspiring managing broker, it's certainly the direction you want to go for a course. And it's probably great for any realtor who wants to just a deeper dive around their requirements and their disclosures around that. So I think it's fantastic. I'm excited for it.
The other thing too is that if you're in a larger brokerage where you have somebody in conveyance or in other like a compliance officer who's not the managing broker or something like that, or an administrator who's not necessarily licensed but does a lot of the work in implementing the compliance in the brokerage. The course I would say is targeted to that person as well, more so than a realtor. Like the course the money laundering course that the regulator offers that are required for licensing, that's your realtor course, so that you understand your realtor obligations. This one's administrators, compliance officers, brokers.
Listen, I'll say this right now, being an owner of an office, it would be nice if the agents understood that side of things. So when our compliance officer says you're not compliant, you need to do this, and they're like, screw you, I don't need to do this, or I didn't need to do this some other. Well, no, there's like a real reason why we're saying you need to do it. It's not because we're nitpicking. So I think it would be awesome there. Give me 1 second. I just have to pour tea in this, then I will be right back. And then we're going to dive into the world of, I was about to say anti-money laundering, but that's not where we're going. All right. So material latent defects. I'm going to read a little preamble. You know what I might do is I'll share the screen so you can follow along with me, and then I'll unshare the screen and we will go back to just discussion. Can everybody see what is a material latent defect right now? Okay, I'm going to read it. So we'll just, for the sake of shortening it, we'll call it an MLD because that's what we call it. MLDs are defined by BCFSA's rules and they apply to all realtors. So BCFSA is the one that defines a material latent defect right out of the gate. They are broader than latent defects and fall under a realtor's disclosure obligations. And in bold, I put that not of the sellers. The seller does not have the same requirement of disclosure that we do. They are defects that are not visible upon ordinary inspection, but which may materially affect the property's use or value as per section 59 of the rules of material latent defect. So material latent defect. So let's just look at the highlighted portion because we've already discussed the two A and B, 1A and B, where we fall under common law and seller's requirement for disclosure. Everything highlighted is where you come in. This is where we fall in line. So an MLD is C, 1C, unfit for the purpose for which your client is buying the home. So we'll go into that a little later. Or the party has made this purpose known to you. So they say to you, Mr. Kenny, I want to buy a property and I want to Airbnb it. So they've just made their intention for the purpose of the property that they're buying known to you. You'd have to make sure the zoning in the city that they're buying the property would allow them to do that. Otherwise, it's material latent defect. And that the real estate professional has otherwise become aware of this purpose. It's a defect that would involve great expense to remedy. I'd love to hear from the panelists. How do we define the word great expense? Like, is that a $2 thing? I mean, I say that you sort of jokingly. Is it 20? Is it 200? Is it 2,000? Like, what's great expense? And then B, a circumstance that affects the real estate in respect of which a local government or local authority has given a notice to the client or the real estate professional indicating that the circumstances must or should be remedied. So your seller's already received a letter from the city saying, hey, your deck is encroaching on the neighbor's property, whatever it may be. Or finally, number 4, under section 59, a lack of appropriate municipal building and other permits respecting the real estate. So it's not always municipal permits. Some jurisdictions, electrical doesn't fall under a municipal, but a permit's required nonetheless. So these are things to be aware of. So 3 important things to note: material latent defects must be in writing. They must be separate from any other service written agreement. And the disclosure must be provided to your brokerage and retained in the brokerage file. Once you become aware of the material latent defect, it needs to be disclosed. BCFSA says you must disclose promptly, or at least before any agreement to acquire or dispose of the real estate is agreed upon. That's in brackets. That's an important thing. We're gonna dig in on that one right there, because in my mind, there's a lot of meat on the bone there. I think that's where realtors might potentially fall short, where we could use some help and some guidance on, I think. Disclose the defect in writing to all the parties to the transaction. Should a client instruct you, and Ken, this is where your story came in and was beautiful. Should your seller say, sorry, Don, I like you. You're great. You did a great job on the listing presentation. And yes, we're aware of this material latent defect. I know that deck was done without permits, but I just don't want you to disclose it. I think it's a patent defect. I think it's obvious this isn't the original deck. So I think it isn't a material latent defect. I think it's patent. They can see it. Clearly, it's obvious. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I am going to bring us back to the panel. So first and foremost, I'll start with you, Michael. Are material latent defects, in your opinion, crystal clear in the minds of realtors? Do they understand what they are?
There, I'm unmuted now. You can hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
I find there seems to be a real lack of understanding in relation to material latent defects in the industry. And the fact that acknowledgement of that material latent defect has to be done prior to the seller accepting the offer. It's not something that can be done later. the disclosure can't be in the contract of purchase and sale. It must be separate. So I still find, in my experience, even recently with unauthorized accommodation, I mean, some of the realtors would put a clause in the contract. Most of the realtors would not supply the signed PDS prior to providing the offer. I mean, so even if my seller's interested, we can't accept.
So what do you do?
Well, I guess you could try to get on the horn with that other agent and say, look, you know, my sellers are really interested in your offer, but without the disclosure of the material latent defect, acknowledgement from the buyer, we can't go any further.
And that would suck if they're in multiples and they've submitted the offer and now they can't get a hold of their client to go and revise the offer or get things done up properly. Now they're out, they could potentially be out of time.
Yeah, that could be very true. And it's not revising the offer. It's the fact you've got the offer and you need the disclosure sign.
You need the, yeah.
And in some cases they want to accept, but you can't advise them to accept the offer without that disclosure being acknowledged first.
Well, you can't, right? Like, I mean, there's a clear order on how this is supposed to be done, but I think there's a lack of clarity amongst us as realtors about the order. I think that the order has been spelled out pretty clearly through BCFSA, but yet either we haven't read it or we're not talking about it enough, which is really, I mean, this is the star of the show today. This is why we're doing this. We found that to be the case when we had our office meeting. We felt that was a story for us as agents. And we thought, man, we can't be alone. So let's have this conversation. Let's bring this conversation to the street, so to speak. Let's involve as many realtors as we can so we can start talking about it with nothing more than the intention and the aim of leveling up our understanding around material latent defects so that we can also level up our professionalism, not only amongst ourselves, but in the eyes of the public. So it's also a requirement. Like it's not even about, I mean, it is professionalism, but it's an actual requirement. It's a fiduciary duty. And yet we don't really understand the fundamental of this duty. So, but with that said, so let's go. How, in your mind, Brian, I'll put you on the spot. How do you disclose a material latent defect?
In writing.
You could
yeah,
say,
I mean, ideally the material latent defect form now.
You could drop the mic after you just said in writing because you're done. That was literally it. In writing, you're done. That was literally it. No, carry on. Sorry. No, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking through stuff on BC Realtors Corner and the board's Facebook thing and just seeing where the topics of conversation went around this in the last number of years. There's definitely a lot of realtors in the industry thinking that they can disclose adequately on the property disclosure statement. But of course, like just breaking it down, how we've even gone through it today with patent, latent, and then material latent being like the highest amount of disclosure. But the PDS doesn't talk about like in that same way. It's what the seller's disclosing versus what we as realtors have to. I think it's just, and then the problem with only doing it on the property disclosure, maybe I'm jumping ahead with that. And
you're doing great. You're doing great because you got me thinking of another question for you.
Is just the idea that, I mean, people will say subject to approval of the property disclosure statement. Well, that means they've received it, but they haven't approved it. But then have they signed off that they're okay with the material latent defect? Meaning, the separate form on disclosure is just, I think, the key way to be doing this.
100%.
And then of course putting stuff in the contract as well.
Yeah. Do you know that BCREA has been fighting for the right, or the right's probably the wrong word, fighting on behalf of us as realtors for well over 10 years to create the form, have a separate disclosure for us, and move it off of the common law requirement of the PDS, because the PDS really is at common law. It's a seller's form. All the requirements or all the disclosures in there are for the seller. The material latent defect, of course, the seller signs, but that is for us, the realtors, because it's now disclosing the material portion, the BC, it's us helping us meet our BCFSA requirements for disclosure. And that was something that BCREA, that I'm certainly happy for, that they have been spearheading for us and finally got that change to take place. So that's why we've got these two forms. They're very useful. But yeah, so first and foremost, Brian, you said it right. Like, it's in writing and it's before a contract is entered into. So what does that mean? Like, maybe we could talk about, like, what is the timing of before a contract is entered into? Because you just talked about, or you just mentioned, which I see very commonly, you may have made the PDS, maybe you made your MLD disclosure on a PDS, which is fully acceptable. You can do that there, no problem. You put it on docs, the buyer will have received it, then they write you an offer subject to them viewing. Did they actually then acknowledge an MLD, and is that an effective disclosure, or is that a problem? That's for you, Brian.
That's a problem.
I was looking for my pass to Michael or Carol or Ken button, and I can't find that button. I don't know. I think I'm going to defer to my elders here.
No, I'm going to say it's, you know, a seller can look at an offer, but can't accept without the acknowledgement of the material latent defect. As I mentioned earlier, right? You can't, I mean, you're stuck. I mean, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And, you know, and it's unfortunate because even in this crazy market we have now, I mean, you put it in the private realtor remarks, you know, PDS must accompany offer, say, material latent defect, and you still don't get them.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, that was a trigger for me. I'm like, I know, I get it.
And it's not just, I think the question that Josh was going to bring up earlier was in the PDS, there's that one question that says, does the property contain unauthorized accommodation? Well, yes. But then you have to take it further. And if you're talking, say, about a strata, are you aware of any latent defect in respect, you know, to the property, right? And that's a yes as well.
Of course, that's presuming two things. Number one, that the seller knows. Maybe they don't read their minutes. Maybe they just, you know, put their head down, go into their unit, and then they don't have any interaction.
But if they know about, say, you know, maybe strata's not a great example, but I mean, if they know,
I think it's a great example. Yeah, it's a good one.
If they know or they have a unauthorized accommodation, and I did come across one when I was looking for townhouses in Surrey in relation to a 2-story and basement where they had unauthorized accommodation in a strata corporation, which quite surprised me because I don't know if I've ever seen one before.
Yeah, I don't know either. But let's go back to the problem. Maybe Ken, you can weigh in on this one. Like, it's a problem. Like, you receive a contract to purchase and sale from a buyer, and they've made it subject to review of the PDS. The PDS is the form, like Matt, sorry, I just want to interject. Maz said disclosure in PDS is sufficient, or does it have to be captured or signed off on both PDS and MLD? The PDS is sufficient. BCFSA has said, yes, you can use the PDS, but you just got to note that there are specific disclosures that are better disclosed on the MLD form because they fall under your requirement of the material latent defect through BCFSA. The PDS is a common law form. Remember that. It is a seller's option to fill it out or not. And we'll cover what Rasika has mentioned as well as Gertrude. But so essentially, Ken, what do you do when you've got an offer that's subject to review of the property disclosure statement, but you know darn well that agent, maybe you didn't put it on docs, maybe you emailed it to them a day or two before or the morning of the offer. Like, what do you do when the offer shows up and you're disclosing an MLD in that way? What do you do?
Well, I personally agree with Michael and Brian. Thanks for the offer. We're prepared to work with it, but can't do it. Well, you have not done your part, so you're not allowing us to do our part. Ironically, times have changed so much in our profession that Jane has prepared realtors' instructions on each of our listings and left them out. And they walk them through all these things to do the proper steps to get the offer presented. It's amazing how many times the offers still come in and they just don't read it.
Do they read it, Ken?
I'm sorry?
I said, do they actually read the attached document?
You can just stop it. Do they read? You know what? I doubt it because very few of them do it properly. They all are doing it by the seat of their pants. But something else with material latent defect for anybody that's online here that isn't from the Maple Ridge area, watch your back, watch your buyer's back. We've got something called the Fraser River Escarpment Policy. And that falls right into material latent defect where the buyer can't use the house for the intended purpose. He was going to put a big shop on it. Nope. Make
Or a
sure you're
pool.
covering your back.
Yeah.
Sorry, Josh, you were saying?
Or a pool in the backyard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I know
Yeah.
Aaron and I have had experience with your instructions, your realtor's instructions. I know more he than I, but he shared those with me. So they're very thorough. They get the job done.
If they would use them.
Well, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to use them? Wouldn't that be ideal?
Yeah, oh yeah, if everybody would just send in the disclosure form rather than the PDFs.
Let's circle
Sorry,
back.
this is one
So-
of those calls where the government is suing us for something.
Yeah. I bet you that's Ken's phone. Is that right, Jane? It's your phone, yeah.
It was the landline.
What's a landline?
It proves to the government that we just use our cellulars for business.
Wait a second. Listen, you started this off by saying you've been in the business since the day Moses invented dirt, I think is what you said. So that 31 years ago.
Yeah.
Rasika, I want to address Rasika's question, and Carol, you're welcome to answer this one if you want. But Rasika and Gertrude also, they bring up a point where you sell a property and the sellers strike out the PDS. They sign off an initial, which by the way, you all know that in order for your listing to be a valid listing on MLS through our board, you have to submit a PDS. So if the seller's not going to fill it out, you strike it out. But what if there's an actual disclosure that needs to be made but not made? What do you do? I think that's what you're questioning.
All right. Well, I look at it that, okay, if the PDS is crossed off, and any PDS, as we know, sometimes some of the sellers are answering to the best of their ability. They don't know all the answers, right? You have some seniors and stuff like that. So again, the buyer should acknowledge that it is answered to the best ability and do their homework on that PDS. So maybe in front of our offers, when we're sending our offer in, it should be a requirement that the PDS or material latent defect form is signed in front of the offer, even if it's a subject to the offer, before any offer is looked at. Refuse to sign? Okay. Well, you know, that is another issue when people refuse to sign things. And again, that can be written in our contracts where both buyer and seller are required to sign any or all documents required for material latent defects, and or the offer cannot be reviewed or looked at. So that can be easily resolved, and that can be written as part of a contract, not part of the subject, but part of the contract for a contract to be valid. It puts sellers in a good situation. But I mean, it's either that or the sellers want to end up in court down the road.
So on the heels of court, the word court, which no realtor wants to be in, Maz asks a question with regard to an MLD. My seller client refused to sign off on an MLD on an unauthorized suite as they thought it would affect their property value. How would you address or explain it to your clients? Who wants to tackle that?
I guess, yeah, Josh, I can. I guess in a situation like that, if a seller refuses to disclose a material latent defect, I mean, you can talk through it as many ways as you want. We talked about that yesterday when a buyer goes into a property with a suite. what do they see? They see a suite, they see potential income, and they naturally assume that it's supposed to be there and it was done properly with permits. And that's where unauthorized accommodation has been labeled a material latent defect. I guess you could try to explain it in several different ways to make your seller understand, but by the time you hit the end of the road, if he isn't going to listen to you, you're going to have to walk away from that listing.
So to be clear, you have to walk away from the listing if they're unwilling to make that disclosure. It's unfortunate, and I like your approach. First and foremost, this is why this is so important. This discussion today is so important, because the more you understand the territory of a material latent defect, the more you understand your responsibility through BCFSA, and you understand the seller's legal responsibility at common law for disclosures of latent or material, well, then not material for us, but latent defects, then that conversation should start to become more natural and easier for you to have with your clients to help them understand this is not really an option. If you want to roll the dice and gamble with another realtor by not sharing an MLD with them, and they take your listing and it sells, you have zero protection when the buyer discovers it and decides to come back and sue you. And so essentially you're just sitting on a lottery ticket for a court case. I wouldn't want to.
If he decides he not only is going to sue you for the MLD, but he's also going to contact BCFSA and file a complaint. And for all of you out there, I personally don't know in any of the cities and municipalities where 2 basement suites are allowed. We all know that in many of the areas where they're building 2 in a basement, they're allowing a legal suite in many of those homes now today. And I think I came across an agent who was saying that, I think the house was in Surrey, that both of the basement suites were legal. And I know in particular in Surrey, you're not going to get the okay for a second suite. So you could potentially have 1 legal suite and 1 unauthorized. And just because even in a single case, like I think Josh brought up earlier, when they're paying the sewer, water, and garbage on the taxes, that does not mean the city has okayed the suite as being authorized.
Right.
And there's potentially still the possibility that if there is complaints in regards to that unauthorized accommodation, the city could come and shut it down.
Well, okay, so to that language, let's talk about that. There's legal suite, authorized suite, unauthorized suite. POCO at one point was saying your suite's illegal, but we've authorized it because you've told us about it. We've not inspected it, but you've told us about it, and you're paying the double water, double sewer, double utilities. So we'll let you go on. But the moment we start receiving complaints from neighbors for unruly tenants or whatever, then you've got a problem. But in their language is unauthorized. So there.
Yeah, I think Josh is correct. I think there's a confusion in terminology, especially amongst the cities and municipalities in regards to basement suites.
Sure. I mean, there's confusion around zoning. RS1 isn't the same size lot, same sort of definition. The language of a lot or a zoning for a lot would vary from one municipality to another. And this is another example where that creeps in. But so, sorry, I want to come back to Krista said she missed the reply. It cut out. If a seller never lived in the home and crosses out the PDS, do they, or how do they disclose an MLD? What's a thought on that?
There's 2 ways. I mean, you could do it. I know Joanna's in our room, and I really would like to see potentially some changes to the BCRA form. Because the form that I'm looking at right now on my screen, it's really geared towards us as realtors. So you almost need a seller's latent defect form, and you need a realtor's material latent defect form. Because like Josh put earlier, the disclosure for each party is significantly different. And the one that BCRA has on web forms is really a form geared towards the realtor, making the appropriate disclosure as through the BCFSA. So I really think we need two forms, or it needs to be reworked to cover both.
Or work to cover both. You know what? But yeah. You know, you're volunteering yourself right now for the revision committee at BCREA.
I just added, talking about standard forms is so far outside my wheelhouse. Jennifer Lynch is really the go-to person, but there's an email there where you can provide feedback and input. Actually, there's another link here where you can, and I'll put it in right now, where you can recommend changes or different things like that to standard forms, and they review those, I think, quarterly. Don't quote me on that. And there is a whole slew of revisions that have been looked at, and you'll hear more about updated standard forms in the coming weeks for launch in November.
Yeah.
For updated forms.
You got it. Chris, I hope that answered your question. Personally, if the seller has never lived in the property but is aware of an MLD, I would use the MLD form. There's no question in my mind. If they don't want to fill out the PDS, that's their right, their common law right. They don't have to. But you need to remind them that in order for that listing to be valid, they do have to sign the bottom, even if they cross it out, so that you can get this thing through. So that's important to know. I do want to, so Maz is asking, if we address the MLD, sorry, let me say, what did you say? If we address the property contains unauthorized accommodations on the PDS, is that sufficient, or does it have to be mentioned as it is a material latent defect? I actually don't know the answer to that question.
I'm going to say it is a material latent defect as well.
So you would need to make a, so you've acknowledged an unauthorized or illegal suite, and you're going to also make a distinction that it falls under a material latent defect. And so you're going to use language like that on the PDS in the notes section, maybe?
Well, the nice thing about that the last questions in regards to material latent defect, it's right above the notes section.
There you go.
So I mean, you know, right away when you put yes, and then right below, I can't remember the number, but something, you know, A, the first one, and then you could write it right in there. It's pretty obvious that, you know, they're really close together.
Yeah, agreed. I like this other question. Maz, you're full of good questions. I just want you to know that right now. With regards to encroachments, if the seller bought a house as is, lived there long and not aware of it, after selling, the buyer would find out who's responsible for damages in courts, assuming you go down that road for an encroachment. Ken, do you have any idea on that? Do you have any thoughts?
Unmute, Ken.
I'm going to unmute you, Ken. Don't worry. You stay right there.
Okay. I started out by saying I'm not qualified to answer that question. But moving on from there, I would think that it's the buyer's responsibility. They chose not to have a survey done. Seller was not aware of it innocently. And there is such a cul-de-sac in Pitt Meadows that they've all come to an informal agreement that we know these property lines are off, but they've been off for 100 years. We're just leaving them off. We've all got good sized lots.
Yeah.
Now, in further to what Ken just said, this week being that I'm taking broker calls this week, we have come across exactly that situation where there was, I believe this property is in the city of Surrey. They made an application, I think it was 2008, 2009, something like that, to, I don't know what the agreement, I think he owned both properties at that time, and he wanted to redefine the property lines. There was kind of a little cutout in the back. He wanted to straighten the property lines. He made the application, and I think it was either the present owner or the previous owner, but it never got finished. And now one of our agents in the office has listed the property for sale, and the seller is saying, no, the lot square footage is actually bigger. And they started to investigate and realize that there was a start to the process to, and we're talking about significant difference. We're talking, I think it was like 4,000 square feet.
Wow.
In this redefined line. And the owner now had built a brand new fence, and today it's encroaching on the neighbor's property.
Wow. I think the key there is that they were aware Whereas Josh, your example, you said the seller wasn't aware.
But what about in the case where he thinks that it was all completed? Now it's coming back to me because I don't have my notes in front of me, that it was the previous owner that he bought the entire property from who said he had aligned the property lines, and this one is this many square feet and the other one's that many square feet, but the process was never completed. So subsequently, the lot on the right got sold. Before that person took possession of that property, he had relined the fence, and now he is encroaching on his neighbor's property.
Sure.
There are a few more questions, and then I'm gonna put up on our share screen on examples of MLDs. So Daniela, yes, if the suite's unauthorized by the city or built without permits, both are considered latent defects, material latent defects. In fact, if they were done without permits, then yes, that's material latent defect. So and therefore that triggers your disclosure, you as a realtor, your disclosure or our disclosure. Judy, thank you. Owners don't have to sign PDSs. I like to make it up. So as we go along, I'll make this up. Sellers have to sign PDSs. Well, apparently.
Hey, Josh, can I interrupt 1 sec?
Of course.
One more thing. I heard they could have had the suite done with I guess with permits, but then I guess if they're putting a kitchen in, they wouldn't be able to get final on those without the city knowing, and they haven't made application for secondary accommodation. So yeah,
there'd be a permit on some level missing. Let's say the entire basement was completely finished professionally with permits, city approval, all electrical, all the plugs, nothing changed. And then the seller comes along and puts a 220 wire for a plug, puts a fridge in there. Now they've turned it into a business, essentially, a rental. They would require a permit. So sorry, you added some more. Judy brings a good point up. They don't have to sign the PDS, but if it's not a rental, the buyer will have a tougher time getting financed. So it may affect your mortgageability if there's no PDS filled out and signed. That's a really good point. Carmen, you said property is owned by a corporation, so no PDS. However, through chatty neighbor, because there's always a chatty neighbor, find out that the home was a former grow up. Now what? Hold on to your seat. Don't know what's going to happen there. I'm signing up for the grow up course through BCREA. I want to know about my disclosure on that. There's a whole world around that. I'm not 100% sure. But see, I think too, if I was just to chew on it for a bit, if you ended up in court here, I feel like a judge is going to go, you buyer's agent, did you exhaust all efforts available to you to try and discover whether something like that existed on a property, first and foremost? A grow up is not a stigma. So, although some might argue, did you go to the city? Do you have copies of your notes, as Ken would say? Do you have a copy of your note that you emailed to them that said, I've been to the city. I asked if there was ever a grow up on the property, and the reply was, do not know, or it's never been busted, or don't know, or yes. Like, do you have that in place? And I feel like, now you're going into the game of mitigating damages for yourself. So you'd want to make sure you have a checklist for a standard business practice of things that you do when there's no PDS. Grow up being a great one. Ken, what are your thoughts on that question or that statement?
Perfect timing, because I've got written down here when I was sitting on the professional conduct committee. I think the words that we heard the most was, did you? Could you have? Why didn't you? And then never mind getting out your checklist, get out your checkbook, because you're toast if you did not do those things.
Yeah.
And I didn't have time for extremely expensive words, very expensive. And I've heard realtors say them time after time. I didn't have time. Well, I guess you got time now. Yeah, you've got to investigate. And this comes back to knowing what you're doing with your documents and knowing the area that you're working in. Yeah. We can all, and I've done it. Jane and I have gone to Kelowna to get a property, which was insane. But the client, old world Italian, he lived in Pitt Meadows, said, do you transfer it to Kelowna? I said, I'll get you Kelowna realtor. He says, old world Italian, I don't want a good realtor. I want you. Shut up and get in the car. So. But would I do that again today, knowing what I know now and all the rules and regulations? Not a chance.
Not a chance. Although it's really interesting because I do see realtors in the Lower Mainland that are listing in Nakusp or Kitimat or Prince Rupert, or they're venturing out. It's brave, brazen perhaps, but brave. I would be nervous to do such a thing.
I mean, Josh, you talked about the marijuana grow-ops. I have an interesting story. I can't even remember the year. It's probably been in the last 20 years. I walked from a listing which came in as a floor call, went to a home in Fraser Heights, met the owner at the front door, went inside, and there was a real absence of furniture. It was really a weird feeling. Worked my way around the kitchen, found the entrance to the basement, walked 4 stairs down into the basement, and there on the floor, I could see these large circles. All the insulation in the basement was pitch black from mold. The hot water tank was rusted out on the bottom. And it turned out I turned the listing down, wanted nothing to do with it. And it turned out that was the very first house that was seized out of the proceeds of crime legislation.
Wow. Good move on your part. Those little circles on the ground when there's no floor, like on the cement, and there's like, they're in nice, neat little rows. And then you look up at the ceiling and there's holes kind of all over the place. You're like, that's weird. Huh, probably nothing.
You know what was really weird with that house? There was black, like kind of charcoal fuzzy mold in all the vinyl window frames on the main floor and the upper floor. Not extensive, but there was mold even on the main floor and the upper floor in the window frames.
Michael, was it the healthy mold or was it the bad mold?
I didn't stay long enough to inhale enough of it.
No, don't worry, buyer. It's okay. That's the healthy mold. You're okay. Carmen wanted to clarify her question. She wanted to know properties owned by a corporation, so no PDS. However, you find out as a listing agent through a chatty neighbor that the home was a grow-op. You're the listing agent. Now, what do you do? So what are your thoughts, Brian, on what you would do in that scenario? Don't defer to Ken again, because he's using your deferral card to defer back to someone else. They're all going to defer. They're all going to defer.
Properties owned. Yeah, I mean, you have to have a conversation at that point with the seller, and we've got to have a conversation at that point. I don't know how I wouldn't. The question says the home is a grow op. Yeah, so at that point you have to have a question, and if they're not willing to disclose it, again, it's the point where you have to walk. I mean, but yeah, the first, now what, the question, you got to talk to your seller. What's the story? This is the word from the neighbor who tracked me down in the cul-de-sac.
Carmen, did you mean to say is, or did you mean to say was? You can type it in or unmute, either or. Maybe she's gone to get some tea. Okay. We are coming close to, we got 3 minutes to go here. I'm gonna pop up some she said is. So it is a grow up. So it's an actual grow up. Well, that's, I mean, you can physically see that sucker then. So I would say without doubt, do you have an obligation to disclose? Ken, what are your thoughts? Carol, what are you thinking? Let's go, Carol.
Absolutely. And one thing to remember, if it's a limited company, it doesn't matter because they have to be disclosed to the ownership of that. So that's an important point. They're still owners. And yeah, it has to be disclosed, period, or walk away. There's no other answer to that.
Got it. Okay. I am going to, in the interest of time, I'll share my screen over here so you can see some examples of MLDs that I had was able to get from BCREA. So you've got lead-based paint. Buyer is buying the property to run a short-term rental, but the realtor knows that the zoning does not allow for this. That's an MLD. So these are all MLDs. Scott, you can mark that up beautifully. Thank you. Buried leaking oil tank, great expense to remedy. City or government body has sent notice to seller to rectify parts of home that were constructed without permits. A load-bearing wall removed without permits, unauthorized or illegal suites. Not disclosing local improvement levies on the PDS. That was in a case that I had read that was back in the 80s. Brian, you mentioned this invasive species. So this was brought up in not illegally speaking, it was brought up in the ethics guys, one of his articles. So plants like Japanese knotwood, giant hogweed, tansy ragwort, yellow angel, oxeye daisy. I had to look these up. I didn't know what they were, but these are invasive species and could be considered MLDs. Illegal grow-ups, obviously. I think I've already put this in there. Buyers desire to buy our home for the purpose of a short-term rental. We already know about that. And a leaky condo. But are there other MLDs? What are your thoughts on this? Do we have more MLDs than just that?
I mentioned the escarpment, your sinkholes.
I gotta say the list is probably endless.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna go on and on.
And some can't to you actually move into the home. So that's the difficult part. So let's say we've had a nice summer. You're not going to discover some of it till it actually rains, like fighting through the tiles around the house, stuff like that. So there's a lot of hidden things that it's not possible to actually move into the home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the seller sells the property in the summertime, and in the wintertime, their children can float boats in the crawl space. I mean, there's a good MLD, right? And
you know what I think would be fantastic? I don't know how something like this thought in my mind would arise, but if there was quite literally a groupthink discussion on as many MLDs as you can possibly think of and define, and put them down so that we can start to get a sense of the territory around an MLD. Because some of those things like you talk about, you might not even think to ask the seller. And the seller might be a little bit confused as to what is an MLD. So floating boats in fall in a basement might be fun for a seller and the kids. So they don't think it's an MLD and they don't disclose it, yet it's an MLD. And I wouldn't have even thought to ask the question if I was listing it in summer. So like, I guess the bigger point is, and I think this is the reason for this, is that we have this confusion around a broader definition. What if there was such a thing, a broader definition of the actual MLDs outside of our requirements to disclose MLDs. And then if you're looking at a broader list of MLDs, I feel like that just somehow would probably inform your discussions that you have with your sellers when you're having them. And of course, if you're a local area expert and you happen to know something a little bit about houses, and you can see a 1950s house built with clay terracotta drain tile and their basements in ground, you might ask the question, do you ever get water in here? Maybe you don't smell mold because the air diffuser is working really well, but that's a conversation I think that would be worth having. Any final thoughts on MLDs before we take off for a 10-minute break? Nope, that's good. I like silence. Very nice. We're going to take a 10-minute break. It is now 10:03. Come back at 10:13. We'll chat with you soon.
Hey, sorry, Josh. I was trying to do something else in the text window, and it was the draw window. Sorry.
I love it. And I could get myself into a lot of trouble releasing that level of control for people to draw and doodle all over my shared screen. That was, luckily for me, I know it's you because your name popped up on the pen. I like this question that Eric asks because there's a lot to be said about legal grow-ops. So where does disclosure on legal grow-ops come in? I'm a little bit fuzzy on that one, Eric. We'll bring that to the panel when we come back. We are going to move into the territory of stigmas next. Ironically, well, I don't know if ironic is the word to use, but in my searching of these topics, there was not a lot of content for patent, latent, or material latent defects in comparison to what pops up when you talk about stigmas. Like there was a ton of information court cases and all kinds of interesting, fun stuff around stigmas. And so we're going to dig in on that one a little bit, and that'll be a fun conversation. And we're heading down the home stretch, so I'll be mindful of time because there's some really important stuff that I also want to cover that I found interesting. I like Daniela, always talk to the chatty neighbors. Yes. Blake, I don't know if you can hear me, but you've got read Mike Megan's Legally Speaking number 502. I did read that. And the part of the concept of what he discussed in that Legally Speaking is in the section on stigmas. There was a ton of information around that, though. There's quite a few court cases on Canley that I was able to read, and BCREA's Legally Speaking series has quite a bit to say about stigmas. So it's a good one.
I just threw two in there, Josh, for when we come back. Those are my final my two thoughts on MLDs. I don't know that they're going to help anything. I think they muddy the water. But yeah, there are two questions I think that make the disclosure part challenging.
Yeah, they're great questions, Brian. That we want. I want to try and make muddy water as clear as possible. And this is a question. I don't know the answer. Like, what's great expense? What's great expense to one person wouldn't even be a drop in the bucket for another.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think some of the things are really clear, right? I think when I'm just looking over again the material latent defect. So again, realtors disclosure, some of it's really clear. There's a permit or there's not a permit. I get that, but when you get into great expense, like literally, again, I just often think of my own deals I've done and did one recently, and the attic is full of my buyers. The attic ends up, we do an inspection, attic's full of rodent droppings to the point where it's probably a health concern. Again, I'm not a exterminator. Anyways, through the whole thing, it all got worked out. But what's a great expense? Like, to somebody, I certainly have clients to replace a fridge is a great expense, but a client that has to remove all the insulation, redo wiring, and do extermination, probably great expense. But where's that line? I mean, I know no one's on here. I don't think anyone's on here from BCFSA, but I think it's like to the point of legislation. It's a bigger deal, but clarity around great expense, I think, would be really helpful.
You know what, Brian, for future, if we do this again, I'll certainly invite one of the PSA and DCFSA to sit in with us, and assuming they're willing to. They often come with very large disclaimers on the front of their email that make them appear less friendly than they really are. They're quite lovely people, but strange enough nonetheless. Gertrude, the MLD you're asking, is a stigma considered an MLD? The short answer, no, not a chance. It's not an MLD, not a material latent defect, because it's a very subjective thing. I hopefully sufficiently answer any questions or thoughts you might be having around that, or we are, I should say, around stigmas. So there you go. I will be right back. See you guys shortly. All right, we're back. This is the home stretch. We're doing fantastic. I think at one point we had 90 people in this room and we're sitting at 87, which I have to say is pretty good. We've not lost a lot of people. This is wonderful news. Just to kind of wake everybody up, if I would, please go to the chat function right now and yes or no, has this been helpful? Yes, no. Yes, no. I'd like to see your responses to this.
Josh, we didn't catch the question. What?
I wanted to know from the people that are here, are they finding this a helpful webinar?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like is it hitting something? Is it striking a nerve for people where they're going, yeah, this was worth my 3 hours? Or wow, what a complete waste of time. Hopefully not, but it's looking like yes.
Good. Hopefully it's helpful. It's important.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So I'm seeing it looks resoundingly yes. What's the word when you're the kind of person that can't handle rejection? Is it just can't handle rejection kind of person? Don't say no. If you say no, make it soft, please. I like velvet hammers. Yeah. What's worth it? Gemma, what did you say? Gemma, what did you say? We call that Josh. Yeah, I do agree. There would be something nice to be said there. Velvet hammer, Josh. Awesome. What I'd like to know from you as well too. So like certain things when I take a course and I feel like, hey, that was a really interesting thing the instructor just said. For example, what's the guy's name? Kevin Brown. Has anyone ever taken a course with Kevin Brown? Teaches contracts boot camp. Anyway, he's a good teacher. He had mentioned, it's the first time I had ever heard the concept. I'll call it concept. I can't think of a better way to describe it. The concept that the PDS, the property disclosure statement, is a common law form. I didn't even know what the frick that meant. Like I had no idea. What are we talking common law? So I Googled common law, but let me tell you what you will find when you Google common law. You will learn all about common law relationships and separations and who gets what and who does, but you don't learn about common law as it applies to real estate agents. So I dug in on that, and that's when I wanted to teach a course on the PDS. So I spent, I don't know, quite a few hours in time writing a course on the PDS, only to click on BCREA's page one day and realize they actually have an education department, which I didn't know, embarrassingly. And there it was, Contract Essentials, all about the PDS. So I took it and I'm like, I scrapped my course. There was no need. They had done a better job than I was going to do. And lesson learned. But I made sure there was no standalone course on MLDs before putting this together with Brian, Ken, Jane, Carol, and Michael. And so I call that a gap in the industry. There's a missing piece in our industry that clearly is needed, and yet for the record, it exists. But my description of its existence is that it's sandwiched inside the two courses that I reference at BCREA, the Disclosure and Real Estates course, which is a great course, and Contract Essentials, Understanding the PDS. So material latent defect is talked about there in detail, by the way. But the problem for me, and I took those courses, I paid for them and took them, and then took them again. The problem is that my brain was so numb and full by the end of the course that I didn't really have a grasp on what the heck I learned around MLD. So I wasn't any smarter for having taken the course around it. And I felt like what we're doing today, which is why I invited Joanna from BCREA, I felt like this could be a standalone online self-paced course and or instructor-led course where you involve more dialogue and discussion. And I feel like this is probably one of maybe a few others where there's a gap on understanding. It's not that the information isn't there, it's that it's not being delivered in a very concentrated way for us so that it sticks. If you guys have, if anyone in here has a thought in their mind about, hey, I wish we knew more about blank, or I wish they discussed more about blank, even if it wasn't a 3 hour, even if it was just a 1 hour, and it's something that you would love more detail on, put that in the chat, because I'm the right kind of geek that would love to go down the rabbit hole and study it and then put something together in rough draft like this, invite BCREA out or the board to see whether or not it has legs to turn into something more concrete and available widespread to members. That's all I have to say about that. So if you have a thought, put it in the chat group, no problem. We're going to move on to stigmas. Does everybody here have a clear understanding of what a stigma is? I know I thought I did until I got into this definition. Then I realized, man, I didn't know what I didn't know. So I will share my screen so you can see what I'm reading, and then I will unshare and we'll go into dialogue. So stigmas, so let's define what they are not. They are not material latent defects. They are not typically required to be disclosed under common law, and then unless. So what does unless mean? We're going to cover that in a second. Stigmas or psychologically impacted properties are subjective feelings of a negative opinion of something based on one's personal beliefs, values, feelings, individual concerns, culture, religion, gender, age, and other individual circumstances. I don't have a definition for other individual circumstances, but I refer back to subjective belief or feeling. So it could be anything, really, is my definition. Since the seller can never predict what a buyer might subjectively dislike, the seller normally doesn't have to voluntarily disclose a stigma. The buyer must ask. Stigmas don't have a legal definition, which I found interesting. In British Columbia, buyers are responsible for conducting their own investigation, which could include inquiries of the realtor who represents them or of the seller's realtor with respect to stigmas. So essentially, what does that mean? It means that if you're working with a buyer, you have to ask your buyers, is there anything about a home that you're looking for that might impact your decision to not want to buy it? And that's the extent of your responsibility. Like, you need to know. Now, if they bring it forward to you, wonderful. Your job is technically done. But it's their responsibility to disclose things like, hey, Josh, I would never live in a home that was once a former grow up. Or Angela, I would never live in a home where there is a child sex offender in the neighborhood as a stigma. Or Almond, they might say, you know what, there's a correctional facility 2 blocks down the way. I'm never living in a home that's in that area. Now, if they tell you that and you show them homes in there and they're not aware of these things and you didn't ask, they could sue you, and successfully too, I might add. So you don't want to be on the bad side of that. So stigmas, what is your thought, Ken, around stigmas? Where does your mind go when we mention this?
Just in your definition, it's an emotional concern. And it's up to the buyer to ask. And as realtors, we should find a discreet way of feeling our way in with new clients and ask them if there's anything that they're particularly looking for or don't want to be around. Give you a heads up too. For years, we would say, especially if it was an estate sale, we would say, did the seller pass in the home? No. Okay. And then a buyer said to me once, brilliant, don't know why I never thought of it. They said, did anybody ever die in the home? Oh, went back to the seller. Yes, a niece had died in the home a few years ago. Fortunately, that came out. And if we know of things like that, we had one where the wife committed suicide in the garage. We just explained it up front. Because as you say, Josh, you know the neighbors are going to be there 15 minutes after the buyers move in. So get it up front.
Ken, to that point, I have to tell you about a case that came out, a legal case that came out of Ontario where a buyer bought a property and moved in and had found out that the seller's son committed suicide in the home 10 years prior. Of course, they never moved out of the house. And when the buyer discovered it after moving in, he decided that he was going to sue the seller for not disclosing his son's suicide. Now, of course, it didn't go anywhere, but other than to drag up on the emotional aspect of things, but you just never can know. That's the issue with stigmas, and stigmas have a very interesting definition. I'm gonna share. You know what I think I'll do is I will share examples of stigmas for you right now, because I don't know that this conversation really needs to be belabored a whole heck of a lot. So stigmas: multiple sightings of ghosts on the property. Well, I guess the question was, were you on mushrooms? Like, it went, like, are we, like, you know, facetiously, how did these ghosts appear? What state of mind were you in? Who's to say they were ghosts? I might not see a ghost yet. Spence might see plenty of ghosts. I don't know. Like, we don't know, right? So it's very subjective. Maximum security prison in the neighborhood is a stigma. The original owner died in the home. Murder, if you read Guns, Ghosts, and Grow-Ups, murder, that's your ethics guy. Suicide, same thing. Naked neighbors, that can be a stigma. It's not a latent defect. It's not a material latent defect. It's not a patent defect, because it might be winter when you buy the property, and yet come summertime, you find out that the section of property, a waterfront property you bought, is right next to a nude beach. Well, now you're mad or you're happy. It depends. I mean, who's to know? Who knows where that goes? But naked neighbors, legit. Home was previously broken into and robbed. Sexual offenders reported to live in the neighborhood. Former resident was suspended of being in an organized crime gang. The house numbers might add up to the wrong number, from a feng shui point of view, could be a stigma. Was that a question, Maria?
What is that proof?
Pardon?
Sorry.
No problem. Were you meaning to be muted, or did you have a question?
Nope.
Okay.
I can mute myself.
No problem. Then you've got remediated grow-ups. You've got the 4-pot grow-up. You need to disclose it. Neighbors are suspected hard drug users. So your neighbors could potentially cause a property to be a stigma. Homeless shelter nearby. So these are examples of stigmas. Sorry, Brian, Ken, Carol, Michael, I didn't mean to steal the show on you on this one, but I don't know that this conversation has a ton of meat on the bone. I'll just read these what to do scenarios, and then we'll have a brief conversation around it. And if there's any questions, let's go into it. But so what do? Once aware of a stigma, a listing agent should seek instructions to voluntarily disclose it, or alternatively to disclose if asked. So you got to go back to your seller. I mean, Brian, you said it earlier, always go back to your seller, your client, and ask. A buyer's agent should ask about any stigmas of concern to their buyers that the buyers have made known to them, going back to the MLD disclosure. Sellers must always answer specific issues related to questions truthfully if asked a direct question from the buyer. So they can't lie. There's really only two options in their answer. If a listing agent chooses to answer, they must tell the truth. They either answer the question directly, or they say, look, I decline to answer, and I advise you to conduct your own investigation, which is in itself an answer. And the realtor must also want to consider adding a term to the buyer's agent might want to consider adding a term to the contract and customizing it to address the buyer's particular areas of concern pertaining to stigmas. So rather than relying on your memory to ask every time you're out showing properties, make sure you've got a clause that covers it. Let's see what we've got here. Spence is more spiritual than me. Yeah, Spence is definitely one spiritual dude. Did anyone ever tell you that Ryan Gosling looks like you? I'll be the first. What's wrong with naked peeps? Yeah, good point. Depends on who. Simple explanation from the PDS course. A stigma is something you feel about a property. Not only the truth, but in full. Right on, Nicole. Absolutely. So it's an interesting thing, right? So you've got two options for number one. You've got to go to your seller and say, look, the buyer is asking us a question about whether there were any deaths. And maybe at this point, you're 3 weeks into a listing, the seller's not even disclosed it to you, but now they tell you, well, now that you ask, yeah, there was. So there's that. And now you've got to decide how you're going to answer that. You've got two options: answer it truthfully and fully to the best of your extent, I think is the exact words. And then, or decline to answer. Who asked me the question about the grow up, 4-pot grow up? That was something that we were given an answer for when we asked the question directly of a listing agent. They told us we declined to answer, and we need you to do your own investigation, which of course right away we now know there's likely some activity there. Carol, have you ever run across stigmas or anything that kind of isn't on this list or that is a bit of a unique scenario?
Nothing. Well, the feng shui thing, and I guess you can class that almost as a stigma. You know, is the window facing the right way? Is the grass facing the right way? Is the sidewalk the right way? And they're not defects or anything like that, but it was important to some client I was working with, and I must have showed them 100 houses, and every one of them, because of their belief, was not acceptable to them. So I guess, lesson to myself, I should have interviewed my clients on a much deeper level once I started to figure that out, so I wasn't wasting their time and my time.
I'm right. Like your property's facing a T in a cul-de-sac, right? So now you're potentially a stigma. Andrea Jock, did you have a question?
I guess the definition is so different to everyone. It's really taking time.
Hi, Josh. Just about stigmas and going back to the grow ups for a minute. Regarding the legal grow up, the cultivation of cannabis, you have a really nice, say for example, lady that for medical purposes grew some plants, but she obviously, you know, because of, actually I've even heard because of medical reasons, and if it's for her husband or whoever, you know, I'm just using an example. She was feeling that she didn't have to disclose because even when you talk about medical records, they're very private. So technically, from what I understand, for example, a lady like this wouldn't have to disclose, but under material latent defects, but it would be considered a stigma. Is that correct? I'm just giving an example.
Well, sure. What are your thoughts on that, Carol? What do you think?
Yeah, it would be a stigma. You know, some people just don't want to be associated with that. They feel that that's not where they want to be or stuff like that. So even if it's a legal one, they still feel that they could be at risk. So I look at it, you know, you got your buyers and they've got a little girl 3 years old, and they figure that there's going to be a lot of drive-by people that is going to make them uncomfortable, because if people know that location, it's something that people might not want to move into that home. And I was going to give another example too, just popped to my head. Out at UBC, they were going to build a senior facility, but a lot of the students there said, we don't want that because of their culture, being afraid to be next to where the seniors would be passing on. And they didn't want that building built because they felt they didn't want to be close to the death. So again, it's kind of interesting, but everybody's again going to have their own opinion on these stigmas as to what bothers them.
And therein lies the issue. We're talking, I mean, that's a definition that's not on the list. I certainly didn't see that pop up when I Googled it. And yet it's subjective. It's based on someone's personal feelings of a negative nature towards something, and now you've got a stigma. I think this could be a very big list, really. So it's important to know what would impact or wouldn't impact their decisions. And truth be told, I don't think you could possibly ever know, nor would the buyer ever likely always disclose everything that's on their mind. So I think it's an interesting one, but the bottom line is there's no requirement for disclosure. John Kenny, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Josh. Thanks, John Kenny, first-time caller, long-time listener. I've listed 3 or 4 estate sales in the last 30 or 40 days, and 3 of them, nobody asked any questions about whether the previous seller had passed away. One did ask the question verbally during the offer process. It was my understanding that nobody had passed away in the unit. So she just verbally asked me that. I said, I do not think that anyone did. And then we moved forward, got accepted, and we're going along. That's just a verbal question. Like, shouldn't she put something on a document? You know, some kind of addendum saying nobody's passed away in the unit?
What do you think, Brian?
Or if I was the...
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'll let Brian tackle that one.
I mean, yeah, I think it comes down to if it was important enough to her buyers that they'd walk on a place, you want something more than that. And I had a similar one to you, John, and not too long ago, and I had to go back. I didn't know what how my seller wanted me to answer that question. And I had to go back to them, and it took some time because it was a spouse that had passed. And yeah, in the end, yeah, that's a really good question. None of it was in writing, though. The seller gave me permission, not begrudgingly, but it was like, well, whatever, I want the deal to go together. This is the right deal in every other way. I guess say it, but I don't think my seller would have said it in writing, interestingly.
So that's nice to flip the script then on a buy side. If it's extremely important to your buyer that nobody passed away in there, you would then do some kind of paperwork, an addendum or something saying buyer and seller acknowledge that nobody has passed away in this unit, and you get that signed.
Yeah.
Fair to say? Okay.
Yeah.
John, I'd put it right in the body of the contract.
Yeah.
I put things like that in quite often, covering everybody's back. Because you put it in the contract and the seller knows it's not right. There's your concentration right there. And now you're going to get it straightened out.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And to go back to the original situation as the selling agent, it is still my understanding nobody has passed away. However, if it turns out that we're wrong and someone has, likely that buyer wouldn't have recourse based on a verbal question. Is that fair to say?
I'd still be looking in writing myself, but that's just me.
I'm going to say I agree with Ken. I certainly wouldn't want that tested in court. Although I don't know that it all depends on how that conversation was put forward. No, I don't know. I wouldn't know. I mean, if a buyer says to their buyer's agent, I don't want to buy a property in that scenario that you described, John, and that was something that they had a clear conversation, then the buyer's realtor has a fiduciary duty to follow up on any property the buyer's interested in with respect to that question. And if I were the agent representing that buyer, that question's coming to the listing agent through an email, so I can get a reply back by email, and now my butt's covered if we go to court. I'm not doing verbal period, so exactly. I think that's just nerve-wracking. No thanks. But you would want to have your response to his their verbal question probably concretized by an email. I'd put it in an email and send it back. That's what I would do.
I like that. Back to my sellers. Okay. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Brian, do you think that would be the way to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I had to do in my scenario. I made sure I had a conversation on the phone with so it's basically the same scenario as John's with my seller. Mm-hmm. In that case, there was a seller, it was a husband and wife. So there was a seller I could still talk to. I spoke to the seller and I'm like, hey, I'm going to fire you an email off about this. So, I mean, again, I know she would have bristled at like an addendum or something, but at least I covered, I think, myself in the email that she said, okay, go ahead. You can go ahead and tell them. So at least I covered my side of it, where we had it in the email, which I think Eric mentioned something in the chat here. And then, well, of what the buyer's realtor should have done. I don't know what that agent did, but same thing, could have CC'd my response to the buyer. Not me, the buyer's agent could have done that. So I think at least having email in regards to that. I don't know, I've never seen it in addendum at all. Have Michael or Carol seen anything like that where it's actually in an addendum?
No,
I think Ken brought it in the contract. Makes
I've never
sense.
seen it before. I remember back in the late 90s, I sold a condo in Cloverdale where the seller actually had passed away in the unit. And I think it was upon the home inspection, the buyer asked me, well, did the seller die in the unit? And I looked at him straight face and I said, yeah, absolutely they did. And it never went any further. It was a condo
Yeah,
catering.
I've never seen anything in the contract, but if it's really important, I go over the rule of thumb, everything in writing. So if it is a concern, put it in the contract, because you can't go back after the fact. And sometimes the addendums are not always great. I think should up front, up forward, put it in the contract if it's a big concern. And then it can be disclosed that way.
I would agree. All right, let's move on. I'll just quickly scan here. Properties manager, properties backing onto a cemetery. That could very well be a stigma to the right kind of buyer, unless, you know, like, it depends. Can you see the cemetery? And then there's no depends. It all depends on the buyer, essentially. Some buyers might appreciate the quietness of a property located like that. Others might not appreciate the fact that there could be spirits lingering. Who knows? If you know there's a cemetery right next to a property you're selling, I would not hesitate to have that question with my client. Hey, you know there's a cemetery. How do you feel about that? And then I would document their response in case their feelings change. But a good question. And Jane, your question about that Vancouver case in Shaughnessy a few years ago. Yeah, I read that case in preparation for this. Did you want to share about that, or were you asking for some background on it? Ken, can you see Jane right now? Can you just ask her?
She's shaking her head no.
I was just pointing out that you were referencing an Ontario case, and we actually have one right here in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And it originally the court ruled in favor of the buyer, and then the Court of Appeal ruled in favor of the seller. So that's a good one to read when you have a minute to read it.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Let's dive into, we're getting down the home stretch here. I have to say, for the record, for all of you in here, I was worried that we were going to make this go to 3 hours. I called everyone on the panel saying, look, do me a favor. This has got to go to 3 hours. I made this promise and we have to keep it. So, but we're 20 minutes out from making the finish line, and there's still some stuff to cover that I wanted to. Let's talk about caveat emptor. What the heck is caveat emptor? What does it mean to a buyer? What does it mean to a seller? It's not a big conversation, but let's just go down the road of caveat emptor. Michael, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, absolutely. In our system of law, there is the concept that the buyer has to do their due diligence. They have to be able to do their investigations. Otherwise, they don't have any claim to go back on anybody if they don't do their due diligence. I mean, it's a very old term, right? Going back, I mean, it just says let the buyer beware, right?
I'll read the definition for you. So it's the
Sure.
doctrine of caveat emptor, meaning let the buyer beware. You just said it perfectly. Is generally understood to operate in real estate transactions. So that's typically where this word pops up, is in real estate. Absent fraud. So we'll cover fraud in a second. It's the responsibility of the purchaser, you know, this is an old definition when they use that word, to investigate the real property they are buying and to protect themselves through the contract. So caveat emptor is pretty old. But what does that mean? So caveat emptor, buyer beware. What are we actually saying to the buyer? Do we even use the word, hey, buyer, just so you know, there's caveat emptor here?
the responsibility of the buyer to do their own investigation, obviously through their realtor, through an inspector, and tying it now back to patent or patent defects. Check those charges on the title, make sure you know them. Terra Firma is great for that, but also get into City Hall and check. We were looking at a property in Maple Ridge a couple of years ago. There was a gas line pipe in the backyard. No big deal. Seen them lots of times. Usually it's what? Nothing. You can't build anything within about 4 feet of the line. Went to City Hall and checked and just got blown away because she said, you can't build anything in that backyard. You can't have a garden there. So I called the buyers. We went back to the house, stood in the back deck and looked at the yard. And we got a tape measure and found if you measured from the back fence towards the house, none of that yard until you got to the edge of the sun deck could be used. We went to the neighbor next door to see if they were aware and doing anything. And he said, oh yeah, he says, I tried to sneak a garden on here a few years ago, but they're using drones as flyover. And they caught them. They caught them. So there's a patent defect. Do your homework.
Do your homework. Yeah.
I showed a townhouse last Sunday, and there was a really odd bunch of vacant land in behind. It looked like there'd been some recent logging and something else. And I asked him, well, what's going on back there? He goes, oh, I think it's going to be a park. Well, it took me about 5 minutes when I got home and realized there's going to be 18 single family homes there.
There might be a playground in the backyard of one of those homes. So does that fall under the definition of park?
You know, and it was imperative to my client is that she doesn't like noise. So, you know, she's going to buy a property, move in, and then for the next 2 years, there's going to be construction. That's going to drive her nuts.
I think, yeah. The only other comment I would make around caveat emptor buyer beware is that it doesn't apply. A seller can't hide behind the shield of caveat emptor if they fraudulently misrepresent or conceal disclosures on the property. So that's a no-no. They is reckless as to the truth or the falsity of statements relating to the condition of the home. Knows of latent defects rendering the house unfit for human habitation, or breach the duty to disclose a latent defect which renders the premises for dangerous. So the bottom line is it's not a shield that can be hidden behind easily. It's not a shield that can be hidden behind easily.
Brian, I think the only other thing I would say, Josh, with caveat emptor and patent right now, and I think everyone knows this, but like it's the reminder that in the speed of the market that we're in, it's on the agent to talk to the buyer's agent to talk to their buyers and be like, look, we were in this home for 15 minutes. And there's going to be 30 offers on Tuesday. Like this is the responsibility of patent defects are on you as the buyer. And I'm going to do the best I can in my 15 minutes in the house. I know that's not everything, but it's a lot right now. I think it's really pertinent in the market that we're in.
Thank you for saying that. So for everyone listening, Brian just said something super like that's critical, that you're having conversations about what are the risks associated with whether you're going in subject free or you're competing and perhaps didn't have time for an inspection or whatever. You got to be sure to have a conversation to let them know that there may be some things that pop up that we just would not have been able to capture. Another thing.
Josh, can I just add here?
Yes.
The issue I have, with all of this is like, let the buyer beware is basically out the window. It's essentially all on the realtor. We're in a market that there's only so much one person can do, you know what I mean? And yet, we still have a board who can slap you with $25,000 fines and, remove your license, blah, blah, blah. The point is do we just walk around with disclosure forms and a list of all the items and this, you know what I mean? Like, should I just walk around with a booklet of disclosures because in the end, then I'm just protecting myself, right? And because it's just the reality. We're dealing with used houses here.
Yes.
There's a point that it gets ridiculous. And like, I understand, it's not that I don't want to do a good job, but you know, when we're talking about, you know, potentially noise issues or so on and so forth, like I'm not going to camp out at someone's house when, as you pointed out, there's going to be 8 or 10 offers on that place. Like I just want to know, ultimately, you know, I'd like to see procedurally, this is what we want. So for our listings, if we add the MLD and we give directions on how we'd like that done, like we were talking about the PDS, please sign that as well. But then give us a direction, because you're changing the board, the whole system is changing this constantly month after month. And, you know, we're out there, we still have to eat. You know, I can't research every property to the nth degree.
What, Nick, that's beautiful. Thanks for saying that. Because you know what, we're not out there to really protect our own asses. We're there to protect the clients, do our best to protect the clients to the best of our ability, and hiding behind a disclosure form isn't the best way of serving a client. I think that's no truer words have been spoken. That's actually true. So would any of the panelists, would you like to address that? Ken's already unmuted, so go for it, Carol.
I was just going to mention quickly that I was talking to Josh earlier today here, that I think maybe we should look at, and it could be a mandatory thing, that there is a holdback on every contract of $5,000 or whatever for MLDs for 30 days. So it gives time for buyers to see if there's stuff that is hidden or whatever, which I think then it will push the sellers to tell the truth. It protects us, because really, and I say this in my classes, we're just the GP sending everybody to the specialists. But in these kind of markets, sometimes you can't just do this or find answers in a day or so, because it takes more investigation. So if we kind of did a holdback on these contracts, and all contracts have a holdback, regardless, I think that could potentially help us, and it's going to push the sellers to tell the truth about the property. Just my thought.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate that. It's possible. And the holdbacks, I mean, it's wonderful. We used to do holdbacks for leaky condos. That was probably one of the more common places to see the holdback clause around that. And on occasion, if you've got a property that has an excessive amount of garbage on it, you might say, we're going to do a holdback to ensure that you clean it. And if it's not cleaned on completion, we'll use the proceeds of the holdback to take care of the property. But
I wouldn't like to see government legislation stepping in to start trying to control a free market system, like passing legislation federally, making every province force home inspections.
You got it.
I think it gets dangerous when the government starts preying into free market systems. I don't think we can do a blanket holdback. I don't think the sellers are going to allow it, and I don't blame them. How do you get, if there's a dispute in relation to the holdback, what's going to be the process in place to arbitrate the difference? I mean, you create a whole new ball of wax by going there. I like Josh's idea. You say garbage, there's $5,000 worth of garbage in the corner. You want a $5,000 holdback. And if they get rid of the garbage, that holdback or potentially no holdback will happen upon closing.
Okay. You know what I think, going back to Nick's question, because I like it. I think the more informed you are and the more educated you are as a realtor, the better you are able to identify components of a house, understand your neighborhood, understand the nuances of whether there's sinkholes or you're in the Fraser River escarpment area, whether this is a neighborhood where oil tanks used to exist, were prevalent at some point in time. The more you understand these things and understand your craft, the better off you are to have conversations with your clients. And I think that conversation, I wouldn't say alleviates the need for disclosure, but it at least shows that you know your stuff and you're doing your best to protect their interests by sharing things that you see or recognize in a house. I think that's an important aspect. You really got to know. And there's know your product. That's a great way to start to know the parts of the components of a house. If you're not a builder, don't have that background, which I wasn't, it taught me an awful lot about structures. And I thought that was really good. I am going to move us on because we're running close. We're running short on time, unless someone has a burning comment there. Good. When to disclose. We talked about it, so we know when to disclose, but let's just hit it one more time. This is disclosure. This is the definition that's given to us as realtors through BCFSA. Section 59(2), disclosures under this division must be in writing, and they must be subsequent to being separate from the service agreement or any other agreement in which the real estate services are provided. So BCFSA is saying, if you're going to disclose a material latent defect, number one, it's got to be in writing. Number two, it has to be separate from the contract of purchase and sale. I want that message to sink in. So if you're a listing agent and you know darn well there's an MLD, disclose it. Get permission from the seller to put it on Realtor Docs or have it disclosed, and make sure that when you get an offer, the other realtor has received it, likely signed it. So that's probably all I got to say. Do either of you have anything you want to add to that?
Don't let your seller accept an offer without that material latent defect being signed.
Yeah, otherwise you really are exposing yourself for future for a lawsuit. You've just bought a lot of.
You're also both potentially could be up before the BCFSA, right? You as a seller's agent shouldn't have advised your seller to accept the offer, and you got both sides of the coin there, right?
Listen, Michael, if ever there was a time that I would never be on the wrong side of the law, it's today. Now that we have a new regulator and they're looking to put someone in their crosshairs and make an example of, this is not the time to be on the wrong side. I don't think it's going to be pleasant. What do we do? What do you do if the story changes? So back to that earlier example I gave, you've listed a property, something you've now discovered that there is a disclosure that needs to be made that wasn't previously made, or the seller tells you, oh yeah, we got permits for that. You find out no permits were taken. What do you do? Do you change? Like, where do you do there now? What would you do, Ken, in that scenario?
Yeah, I believe you have to disclose. You discuss it with the seller and you've got to disclose. At least that's my position.
Your position is in alignment with BCFSA under section 59-3?
If you say so. Okay.
To be specific.
And in this fast-moving market right now, with the fact that you got offers on Tuesday, I mean, if your seller obviously is on site, they have to be, and you amend the disclosure statement, you post it to associated documents, and then you go to touch base and send everybody that's been interested in the property that there's been an amendment to the disclosure statement.
Yeah.
You bet. And when the story changes like that, yeah, you said it right. You got to let everybody know that was interested in the property. Things have changed. You update the PDS. Obviously, you discuss it with your seller first. Anything I say is based on the premise that you've already had the discussion with the seller. But you have the discussion with the seller, you update the PDS and any other disclosure. If you're going to do an MLD now, you add it to Paragon Docs. You make sure that all realtors are aware that it's there. You update your realtor comments so that people are aware that the story's changed. Then
that's key. That's key. Conversation with the seller, conversation with the buyer. Prepare them for all these things. Yeah.
So I want to ask a question then. So you've disclosed the MLD. The buyer has done their job. They've signed it off. And you now have a copy of the signed MLD or the signed PDS, and they didn't make it subject in a contract. So right now we're following the right lines. What should we add in the contract of purchase and sale to really cement the deal? Should there be any way to acknowledge the disclosure? I see Eric's ahead of us in there. Good job, Eric. So BCFSA says that, and they provide a fantastic way for us to do this on the contract of purchase and sale. It's in their language. It's on their website under knowledge base. It's disclosure of material latent defects. Simply put, you say the buyer acknowledges having received separate written disclosure of a material latent defect relating to, and then you describe the defect. And that goes in the contract of purchase and sale. And this makes it crystal clear. The buyers received it prior to this contract being entered into, and they've signed off on it. They've acknowledged it. And that's how you protect your asses and your clients and the sellers. That's how everybody stays safe. And that's how you raise the level of professionalism, by really disclosing this in a proper manner. That's all I have. We are 3 minutes away from the end. We're going to make it. Are there
Can I just throw in something that's really petty, but we address it in every offer we receive. It says that the seller agrees or understands that all the included items will be in proper working order upon possession. Well, if you look quickly, there's roughly 23 faces in front of me. I got 23 different opinions of what proper working order is. We always strike out the word proper and put in reasonable. Because they can have different interpretations. We had one lady get very, very mad at us. We were the seller's realtor. She was the buyer. That dishwasher or clothes washer just didn't work right. It was not in proper working order. Oh, why is that? Well, it doesn't work the same as the one I used to have.
Are we selling houses or are we selling appliances?
Exactly. Yes.
No,
Stop
I'm
them from
almost in
making a big
favor of
issue.
striking those completely from contracts because we're not appliance salesmen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's great.
Yeah.
They want to have it inspected.
Yeah, 100% for sure. If anybody else has anything they want to ask in here, by all means, please do. I want to thank everybody for being here. I would love to thank the panelists. Brian, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Incredible job. Well done. Carol, well done. Beautiful stuff. Michael, Ken, as always, you guys are awesome. Thanks for sharing your time, your knowledge, being vulnerable and just putting it out there for everyone here to hear your thoughts, and also sharing stories from the field, your own personal experiences. You've done a great service to the real estate industry, and I want to personally thank you very much for that. This was enjoyable. I really like this. This is the kind of conversation I would love to see more of. And for anybody in here who would like to see conversations like this of a different topic, of a similar nature but different topic, by all means reach out to either one of us on Facebook, and we will get busy putting something together for you. If you would like to see this taught again, or you think there's other people that could have been in here or wanted to be in here and didn't make it, and you think this should be taught again, go onto the Facebook page that it's been posted on and share your thoughts and comments. And just in general, go onto the Facebook page and share your thoughts and comments on there. Thank you all for your time, your 3 hours, and for being here, for contributing in the chat room. I greatly and generously, I appreciate what you've done for us today. Thanks for making our industry a better place. And with that, it's recorded. Yeah, it's recorded, and I'll find a way to share a link of the recording on the Facebook sites, the Realtor Facebook sites, so that you can share that around or go back and watch a portion of it if you want to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.